Walter Crowe snatched the coins right out of Eliza's open hand. Not from the counter. Not from a jar or a drawer. From her actual hand, fingers still warm from the stove, knuckles still red from scrubbing iron pots since 4 in the morning. He pinched the coins out of her palm the way a man takes something that was never his to begin with, because in his mind it never had been. "Deduct it," he said, not even turning to face her. Hendricks complained the biscuits were cold. "That's your fault." Eliza's hand stayed open in the air for a moment after he walked away. Empty. Like she was still waiting for something that had already been decided before she woke up that morning. She was 26 years old. She had been working at Raven Hollow Way Station for 3 years. She knew how to stretch a pound of flour into enough bread to feed 12 men. She knew how to quiet a crying child in the back room while the parents ate in the front. She knew which travelers needed extra coffee, which ones needed less, and which ones were going to cause trouble before they even stepped through the door. She knew everything about that station except how to make Walter Crowe see her as a person worth keeping. She closed her fingers around the nothing in her palm and went back to the kitchen. If you've ever stood in a place and done everything right and still been told you weren't enough then, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Raven Hollow. Back to the winter of 1889. Back to the night everything changed. The cold that settled over the territory that December was a different kind of cold than the years before. It didn't creep in gradually. It arrived all at once, the way bad news does suddenly and without apology. The kind of cold that cracked the mud in the road into plates like broken pottery and froze the water trough solid by 2 in the afternoon. The kind that made men ride faster just to feel their legs again. Raven Hollow sat at the junction of 2 supply routes that connected 3 towns nobody had ever bothered naming on a proper map. It wasn't much of a town. It wasn't much of anything, really a cluster of timber buildings that had survived more winters than they deserved. A stable that smelled the way stables do, and the way station itself, which served as a dining room, a resting place, and the only source of hot food for 40 miles in any direction. That last part was the reason Eliza Vane was still there. She had arrived 3 years earlier, with a letter of recommendation from a hotel cook in Cheyenne, who had taught her everything she knew about managing a kitchen under pressure. She had arrived with skills, with energy, and with a sourdough starter wrapped in cloth and packed inside a small tin that had belonged to her mother. She had arrived expecting honest work and honest pay. What she found instead was Walter Crowe. Walter was 53 years old and had owned Raven Hollow Way Station for 11 years. He was not a violent man, which he seemed to consider a point of personal virtue, as though the absence of cruelty was the same thing as the presence of decency. He didn't raise his voice often. He didn't make threats. He simply arranged the world around him in a way that benefited himself, and then acted as though any other arrangement was obviously unreasonable. He had a way of stating unfair things in a calm voice that made them sound like facts of nature rather than decisions he was making. Wages were what the market supported. Eliza's hours were what the work required. The deductions from her pay were always for complaints that she could never quite verify a traveler who had already left, a meal that hadn't been written in the ledger, a draft that came through the window she hadn't opened. She had spent 3 years watching him do this to her, to the 2 girls who had worked at the station before her and eventually disappeared, to the occasional ranch hand who passed through looking for a day's work and left looking smaller than when they'd arrived. She had stayed because she didn't know where else to go. That was the part she had trouble admitting, even to herself. She was talented. She knew that in the quiet, honest way that a person knows something they've proved through repeated effort, rather than been told. She could make a meal out of almost nothing. She could manage a kitchen that served 40 men and never lose track of what was needed. She had real skill, the kind that took years to build. But Walter had spent 3 years telling her, in various patient and reasonable-sounding ways, that her skill was only worth what he was willing to pay for it, that she was difficult to manage, that other employers would find her presumptuous, that a woman running a kitchen on her own was not the kind of thing that respectable establishments offered. She had heard it so many times that some part of her had begun to believe it, not the whole of it. There was still a part of Eliza that knew better, that went quiet and hard when Walter spoke that way, that kept a small private record of every deduction and every invented complaint. But that part had learned to stay silent, because silence was cheaper than argument and she needed the roof and the pay, whatever was left of it. The evening Walter took the coins from her hand was a Tuesday. It had been a long day even by the standards of Raven Hollow in December. The stage from Laramie had come through 4 hours late and arrived with 9 passengers instead of the usual 5, most of them cold and irritable, and convinced that their discomfort was somehow the station's fault. Eliza had stretched the evening stew and baked an extra batch of biscuits from flour she'd been reserving for morning. She'd kept the stove going for 6 hours straight and hadn't sat down since breakfast. Hendricks was the name of a man who ran a dry goods supply operation out of a wagon. He came through Raven Hollow every 3 or 4 weeks, ate everything on the plate, and always found something to complain about afterward, not because the food was bad, but because complaining was how men like him felt important. Eliza had seen his type 100 times. He had eaten 4 biscuits that evening. 4. She'd watched him take them. When Walter said the biscuits were cold, he wasn't reporting a fact. He was taking an opportunity. Eliza stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment after he walked away and looked at the room, the long pine table, the fire going low in the grate, the stack of plates she still had to wash. She thought about saying something. She thought about turning around and walking out the front door and not coming back. She thought about both of those things for about 10 seconds, and then she went back to the sink because she had nowhere to go, because the tin with the sourdough starter was on the shelf in her room and she wasn't leaving without it, because it was December and the temperature outside was somewhere below human endurance, because 3 years of being told she wasn't worth much had made the math of leaving feel more complicated than it actually was. She washed the plates, she banked the fire, she went to bed, and the next morning she was back at the stove at 4 o'clock, same as always, because that was what the work required. Caleb Thornton arrived on a Wednesday evening, near the end of a week that had already produced 2 snowstorms and a broken axle on the supply wagon out of Casper. He came in alone, which was the first thing Eliza noticed. Most men who traveled the route between the eastern settlements and the mountain ranches came in pairs or in groups, for safety as much as company. A man riding alone in December was either very confident or very foolish, and this one didn't look foolish. He wasn't a large man in the way that some ranch hands were large, thick through the chest and shoulders, in a way that seemed designed to move heavy things. He was lean and deliberate in the way that people get when they spend a lot of years doing difficult physical work without anyone watching them do it. His coat was good canvas, heavy and well-oiled, not new but taken care of. His boots were the kind of boots a man might have resold twice rather than replaced, not because he couldn't afford new ones, but because they fit the way he needed them to. He sat at the far end of the long table, away from the 3 other travelers who were working through their supper near the fire. He didn't ask for anything immediately. He pulled off his gloves and set them on the table, and looked at his hands for a moment the way tired men do when they're deciding whether they have enough left to be civil. Eliza came out of the kitchen with the stew pot and a basket of biscuits, and moved down the table, same as she always did. She didn't make conversation unless someone started it. She'd found it was better that way. She set the basket at his end of the table and moved to turn back. "How long ago did these come out of the oven?" he asked. His voice was even. Not unfriendly, not suspicious. "Just asking," Eliza looked at him. "About 20 minutes, she said. He picked one up and turned it in his hand. Not in a suspicious way. More the way a person handles something they're genuinely curious about. He took a bite. She had already started back toward the kitchen when she heard him say, "Who made these?" She stopped. Not because it was an unusual question exactly, but because of how he asked it. Most travelers who had anything to say about the food said it to Walter, who was always somewhere visible and ready to accept credit for things he had nothing to do with. The ones who complained did the same. They said their piece to the man in the front room, and the man in the front room nodded and wrote it in the ledger and deducted it from Eliza's wages. Nobody had asked who made anything in 3 years. Not like that. Not like the answer was actually something they wanted to know. She turned around. "I did," she said. He nodded the way a person nods when they've just confirmed something they suspected. "They're the best thing I've eaten in at least 6 weeks," he said. Maybe longer. Eliza stood there for a moment, and something that she hadn't realized had locked up inside her chest shifted slightly. Just slightly, like a joint that's been held in one position too long, and has just been moved a fraction of an inch toward the right direction. "They're not perfectly even," she said, which was something she always noticed and nobody else ever did. He looked down at the one in his hand. "Don't matter," he said. "They're still the best." He went back to his supper. Eliza went back to the kitchen, but for the next 10 minutes, until the fire needed tending and the coffee needed pouring, and the ordinary demands of the evening took over, she was thinking about those 5 words. Who made this? Simple words. The kind of thing a person could say without thinking. But he'd said them like the answer mattered. Like whoever had made the thing deserved to be known. She couldn't quite explain why that hit her the way it did. She was a practical woman. She didn't have much patience for sentiment. But 3 years of being invisible in a room she practically ran had left a mark she hadn't fully accounted for. and 5 words from a stranger at the end of the table had found the exact shape of it. She learned his name because he signed the station ledger when he paid, which was more than some travelers bothered with. Caleb Thornton. He paid in coin, exact amount, no argument about the price. She noticed that because travelers who argued about prices were the ones Walter used as justification for deductions. He was gone before she finished the morning baking. She told herself she wouldn't think about him again. By Thursday evening, she had mostly succeeded. Then Friday came, and at the tail end of the supper hour, she heard his voice from the front room. He'd come back. She stood in the kitchen doorway long enough to confirm it, same coat, same deliberate way of moving, same seat at the far end of the table, and then went back to what she was doing. She told herself it didn't mean anything. Raven Hollow was on a supply route. People passed through more than once. It was not remarkable. She brought the supper out and moved down the table and didn't say anything when she set the basket near him. Cold biscuits tonight, she said, because it was honest, and she'd rather say it than have him find out and feel misled. He looked up at her. There was something in his face that wasn't quite a smile, more like recognition. What happened to the hot ones? Oven's been stubborn this week. Lost about 20 minutes of heat around 4 o'clock. I had to work around it. He nodded, looking at the biscuit in a considering way. Still better cold than most things are warm, he said. She almost said something. She caught herself and went back to the kitchen. He came back the following Monday, and again on Thursday. And after that she stopped telling herself it didn't mean anything, because clearly it meant something, though she wasn't sure yet what. The thing about Caleb Thornton that Eliza noticed before she noticed anything else about him was how he watched. Not in a way that made her feel watched. More in the way that someone pays attention when they're genuinely interested in how things work. He noticed the way the kitchen ran. He noticed the order she moved in. He noticed when she'd had an easier morning and when she hadn't. He noticed when the stove was running low and when the supply of flour had gotten thin enough to change the recipe slightly, in ways that a person who didn't know what they were looking for would never catch. He never mentioned any of this directly. He didn't offer commentary on her work, or make observations that would have been intrusive. But she caught him watching sometimes with that quiet attentiveness, and she started to understand that whatever he was doing at Raven Hollow, he wasn't just passing through. It was on his 4th visit that he first stayed to talk after the other travelers had gone. The front room had emptied out around 8 o'clock. Walter had retreated to his back office to work on the ledger, or pretend to, and Eliza was moving through her closing routine, clearing the table, banking the grate, wiping down the counter when Caleb's voice came from the corner where he'd been sitting with his coffee. "How long have you been working here?" She looked over at him. He wasn't looking at her directly. He was looking at the table, the way people look when they're asking something that matters to them, but they don't want to make it feel like an interrogation. 3 years, she said. "Do you plan to stay?" She thought about that for a second. "It's an odd question," she said. "Maybe." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I've been watching you work for 4 visits. You run this place. You know where everything is, what everyone needs, what's coming before it arrives. Walter Crow does the talking and takes the money, and you do the actual work." He paused. "Is that a fair assessment?" Eliza didn't answer immediately. She set down the cloth she'd been using and looked at him steadily. "What's your interest in that?" she asked. He looked up then. "I own a ranch," he said. "Stone Ridge, northeast of here, about 40 miles. It's a larger operation than most people know. I've got about 60 hands rotating through in busy season, less in winter, and a kitchen that's running badly for 2 years since my head cook left to go back east." He paused. "I've been looking for someone who actually knows what they're doing." The room was quiet for a moment. "You don't know me," Eliza said. "I've watched you work 4 times, he said. "I know you well enough to know I haven't seen better." She looked at him carefully. She was used to offers from men who'd eaten a good meal and gotten generous ideas. She was used to the way those offers were shaped with compliments up front and conditions underneath that only became clear later. She had learned to hear them coming the way you learn to hear weather before it arrives. "What are the conditions?" she said. He frowned slightly, not in an offended way. More like he was trying to figure out what she meant. "Fair pay," he said. "More than you're getting here, I'd expect. Your own cabin. You run the kitchen the way you see fit. I don't interfere with that. And the conditions that aren't in that list," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he nodded slowly, as if she'd said something that confirmed something he'd already thought. "There aren't any," he said. "I know how that sounds. I know you've got no reason to believe it. But there aren't any." She looked at him. He looked back. "Give it some thought," he said. He stood up, put on his gloves, dropped coin on the table for the coffee. "I'll be back through on Monday." He left. Eliza stood in the empty front room of Raven Hollow Way Station and looked at the door for a while after he was gone. Then she went back to the kitchen and started the morning prep 4 hours early, because she couldn't sleep. and there was always something useful to do, and she thought about the offer, the same way she thought about every difficult thing, by working through it with her hands, while her mind sorted out what it actually meant. She didn't sleep well that weekend. Not because she was excited. Exactly, she'd learned to be careful with excitement, because excitement had led her places before that hadn't turned out to deserve it. But because the offer was real enough to take seriously, and taking it seriously meant reckoning with what it would cost to either accept or refuse. Refuse, and she stayed at Raven Hollow. She knew exactly what that meant. She knew the shape of every day. She knew what Walter would take from her next month, and the month after that. She knew how long the sourdough starter would last on that shelf, and how many more winters she could manage in that room before something inside her simply stopped caring about what came next. Except when she walked into an unknown man she'd met 4 times. A ranch 40 miles away. A life she couldn't visualize because she'd never seen it. She spent Sunday lying awake, working through every version of what the conditions might turn out to be once she got there. She was good at that, at finding the shape of hidden things, at reading the landscape of an offer for what wasn't being said. She'd had 3 years of practice with Walter Crowe. But when she went back through her 4 conversations with Caleb Thornton, she couldn't find the hidden part. And that bothered her in a different way than she expected, because she was used to finding it, and the fact that she couldn't might mean either that it wasn't there, or that it was too well hidden to see yet. Monday came. Caleb arrived at the same time as usual. She brought the supper out, and he ate it, and didn't bring up the offer, which she appreciated. He drank his coffee, and spoke with one of the other travelers about road conditions, and whether the route around the North Pass was clear. When the room emptied, she said, without preamble, "I'll need to see the ranch before I decide." He looked up. "Fair," he said, "and I want to talk to the hands, the ones who've been there a while." "Also fair. And if the conditions turn out to be different from what you described," she said, "I want to be able to leave." He looked at her for a moment. "You want to be able to leave any job you take," he said. "That's not a condition specific to this one. That's just how employment works." She didn't say anything. "Come see the ranch," he said. "Talk to whoever you want. Make your own decision." She nodded once and went back to the kitchen. The following Wednesday, while Walter was away dealing with a supply dispute in town, she got on a horse for the first time in 8 months and rode 40 miles northeast in cold. That made her face ache. Stone Ridge was not what she expected. She had imagined a large ranch in the way she imagined most things she hasn't seen, as a bigger version of something she already knew. A larger Raven Hollow. More buildings, more land, same general shape. What she found instead was something that looked like it had grown out of the ground over many years, and many decisions made by people who actually intended to stay in it. The main house was 2 stories and had been added to at least twice, and it showed not in a way that looked sloppy, but in the way a working thing looks when it's been adjusted to meet actual needs rather than built according to a plan drawn up before anyone knew what the work would actually require. The kitchen was a disaster. She walked through it with Caleb and said almost nothing, but her eyes were moving constantly. The placement of the stove, the storage arrangement, the ventilation, the layout that made someone walk 12 unnecessary steps between the cutting surface and the preparation area. It had been designed by someone who had never actually run a kitchen and maintained by people who had learned to work around its problems rather than fix them. She could fix all of it. She knew it the moment she walked through the door, the way you know something before you've thought it through viscerally, before the reasons catch up. She talked to 3 of the hands who'd been at Stone Ridge for more than 2 years. She asked them direct questions and listened to how they hesitated or didn't. She had learned to hear the difference between a man who was telling the truth because he didn't know any other way, and a man who was telling the selected truth because he'd been told what to say. These men were telling the truth. She could hear it. She rode back to Raven Hollow that evening with the wind behind her and the last of the light going out of the sky and something turning over quietly in her chest. She still wasn't sure. But she was closer than she'd been. The decision came 5 days later, not because she'd thought her way to it, but because Walter made it easy. It was a Thursday, late afternoon, and she was in the kitchen when she heard raised voices from the front room. One of them was Walter's. The other was a young woman's, a girl, really, maybe 16 or 17, who'd come in off the road with her family and was trying to explain that one of the biscuits had a piece of grit in it, probably from the flour, which sometimes happened and wasn't anybody's fault. She heard Walter's voice go from patient to ice in about 4 sentences. She heard the girl stop talking. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Walter tell the girl, in his calm and reasonable voice, that Raven Hollow did not accept complaints from people who couldn't be bothered to be clear about what they were asking for, that if the food wasn't to her taste, there were other establishments on the route, that her family was of course welcome to leave, The girl's mother put a hand on her daughter's arm and said nothing. Eliza looked at the mother's hand on the girl's arm. She looked at the mother's face, that careful, held-still expression of a woman deciding not to make things worse, because she knew from long experience what making things worse actually cost. She recognized that face. She'd seen it in a mirror enough times. She went back into the kitchen and finished the biscuits she had in the oven because they needed to be finished. Then she started thinking about the sourdough starter, how to pack it, what she'd need, how much space it would take in a saddlebag if she wrapped it properly. 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, she walked into the front room, while Walter was reviewing the ledger, and told him she was leaving. He looked up. He had the same patient expression he always wore when he thought she was making an error he'd already anticipated. "You won't find better work than this," he said. "Not for a woman without connections." "Maybe," she said. "Crow's is a known establishment. You walk away from that, you're starting from nothing." "Maybe," she said again. He looked at her for a moment longer. "Where are you going?" She looked at him carefully. "Somewhere I was asked to go," she said. He kept looking at her in that assessing way, trying to find the angle, trying to figure out what the actual problem was so he could adjust for it and keep what he'd been using. She could see him working through it. "Whatever you've been offered," he said, "I can match." "No," she said, "you can't." And she went to her room and packed the tin with the sourdough starter and everything else she owned, which was not very much, and she walked out of Raven Hollow Way Station in the early afternoon of a Saturday in December and didn't look back. It was cold enough to hurt. She walked anyway. She had somewhere to be. The road to Stone Ridge was not a road in any official sense. It was more of an understanding between the land and the people who crossed it regularly, a worn suggestion of a path that the territory had tolerated long enough that it started to look intentional. In December it was frozen solid, which made it harder on the horse but easier to follow, because the wheel ruts from the supply wagons had gone rigid in the mud and held their shape like a mold. Eliza rode with her pack tied behind her and the tin wrapped in 2 layers of cloth tucked inside her coat, against her body, where the warmth would keep the starter alive. She had ridden in cold before, but not this cold, not for this long, and by the time Stone Ridge came into sight she had lost most of the feeling in her left foot and some of the feeling in her right hand, and was running, quietly and without panic, a kind of internal inventory of what still worked, and what she'd have to wait on until she got somewhere with heat. Caleb said he'd be at the north gate at 4 o'clock if she sent word. She hadn't sent word. She wasn't entirely sure why. Some part of it was that she'd wanted to see the place arrive the way it would actually look, not staged, not prepared for her benefit, but as it was on an ordinary December afternoon when nobody was expecting a guest. Some part of it was that she still hadn't fully committed in the place inside her where decisions actually lived, and she needed the sight of it to settle the last of that question one way or the other. She came through the timberline and saw the ranch below her. The main house had lamplight in 2 windows. Smoke from 3 different chimneys, the main house, what looked like a bunkhouse to the east, and a smaller structure closer to the stable that she didn't recognize yet. 3 horses in the near pasture moving slowly, unbothered by the cold in the way that well-kept horses are unbothered, because they have enough feed and enough shelter and enough routine to work with. A hand crossing between the bunkhouse and the stable with a lantern, walking quickly but not rushed. It looked like a place that was running. Not performing, running. There was a difference, and she had developed an eye for it over 3 years of watching Raven Hollow perform the impression of a well-managed station while actually operating on Eliza's labor and Walter's accounting. She rode down. The hand with the lantern saw her coming and stopped and raised the light. He was young, maybe 20, maybe a little more, with a broad face and a way of holding himself that suggested he'd been told to be careful about strangers, and was currently working out whether she qualified. "I'm looking for Caleb Thornton," she said. He studied her for a moment. "He expecting you? Probably not today," she said. He considered that, then he pointed at the main house. "Kitchen's around the left side," he said. "He'll be inside. I'll go ahead and let him know." She tied the horse and unstrapped her pack and went around the left side of the main house, the way he'd indicated. She could hear the kitchen, before she reached it, not food sounds, not the usual sounds of a working kitchen in the supper hour. What she heard was a pan hitting something, a curse, and then silence. She knocked on the kitchen door, a pause. "It's open," said a voice that wasn't Caleb's. She pushed the door open and found a man she'd never seen before, standing at the stove with a long-handled spoon in one hand, and an expression that suggested the spoon had recently failed him in some meaningful way. He was maybe 45, thick through the middle, with the look of a man who cooked because someone had to, and not because he'd ever wanted to. "You the woman Thornton's been talking about?" he said, not unkindly. "Probably," she said. He looked at her. Then he looked at the stove. Then he held the spoon out toward her. "Whatever he told you this kitchen needs," he said. he was underselling it. She took the spoon without thinking and looked at the pot on the stove. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that the contents of the pot were a kind of tragedy. Instead, she said, "What's this supposed to be?" "Stew," he said, with the tone of a man who has accepted defeat. She looked at it for another moment. "How long has it been on?" "Since noon." She moved the pot off the direct heat without asking permission. "Do you have any onion left?" He pointed at a basket near the far wall. She went and got 2 onions and started peeling them, and that was how Caleb found her. When he came through the kitchen door 3 minutes later, standing at the counter with her coat still on, and her pack still on the floor where she'd set it, cutting onion with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided something and is now simply executing it. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "I didn't send word," she said. "I can see that. I wanted to see it as it was." He looked at her for a moment, and then looked at the man who'd been running the kitchen, who was watching this exchange with the expression of someone watching a weather system arrive, and trying to calculate whether to stay or go. "Holt," Caleb said, "why don't you go get some supper from the bunkhouse?" Holt looked at the onions. He looked at Eliza. He looked at the pot she'd moved off the heat. "Yeah," he said, sounding genuinely relieved. "All right." He put on his coat and left. The kitchen was quieter after he was gone. Eliza finished with the onion and found a pan and started building something in it that wasn't the stew, but would improve it significantly if she had enough time and the right materials, which she was currently assessing by moving through the storage area with the pot in one hand and her eyes going from shelf to shelf the way they always did when she was mapping a new space. "You don't have to do that tonight," Caleb said. "I'm already doing it," she said. "Where's your salt?" He pointed. She found it. "This is the cabin?" she said, moving to look out the small window above the counter. "No, the cabin's the smaller building east of the stable. I'll show you after." She nodded and went back to what she was doing. He stood in the kitchen doorway for another moment, and she was aware of him watching with that same quiet attentiveness she'd noticed at Raven Hollow, not supervising, not assessing for critique, just watching the way a person watches something they're interested in, and not inclined to interrupt. "You decided then," he said. "I decided," she said. He didn't ask which way, because she was standing in his kitchen, salvaging his supper at 7 in the evening after riding 40 miles in December cold, and the answer to that question was obvious to anyone paying attention. "I'll get your horse put up," he said. He left. She cooked. The cabin was not what she'd expected, and she had already stopped being surprised by the fact that Stone Ridge kept failing to match her expectations. She had expected something basic: 4 walls, a stove, a cot, the functional minimum that an employer provides when he says he'll provide housing, and means it in the loosest possible sense. What she found was a space that someone had recently attended to with the kind of care that doesn't come from obligation. The stove was clean and had been blacked recently enough that there was no dust on it. The floor had been swept, and 2 of the boards near the west wall had been replaced with new timber that still smelled of fresh-cut wood. A shelf had been built into the wall above the window, the kind of narrow shelf that is exactly the right size for a tin and a cloth-wrapped bundle, and it had been built at a height that made sense for someone to reach without stepping up. She stood in the doorway and looked at that shelf for a moment. Then she walked in and set her pack on the floor and took out the tin and set it on the shelf and stepped back to look at it. Something moved in her chest that she didn't have the right word for. Not gratitude exactly. Gratitude was the thing you felt toward someone doing you a favor, and this felt different from that. It felt like being seen in a specific way. Not generally seen, not noticed as a presence, but seen in the actual particular detail of who you were and what mattered to you. He had known about the starter because she'd mentioned it once, briefly at Raven Hollow, while explaining why she couldn't leave in less than 2 days. He had listened, he had remembered, and at some point between that conversation and tonight, he had built a shelf at exactly the right height. She sat down on the edge of the cot and took off her boots and felt the blood come back into her left foot in a way that was extremely unpleasant and entirely welcome. She had made a decision. She was going to have to see how it went. The first 2 weeks at Stone Ridge were an education. Not in the way that being instructed is an education, but in the way that encountering a real thing is. She learned the ranch the same way she had learned everything else in her life, by paying attention to how it actually worked rather than how it was supposed to work. And by noting the difference between those two things. The kitchen had been run for the past 8 months by Holt, whose name was Darnell Holt, and who turned out to be one of the senior hands, a man who'd been at Stone Ridge for 7 years, and who had taken on the cooking not because he had any aptitude for it, but because the alternative was a rotating schedule that nobody wanted to manage. He was grateful in the uncomplicated way of someone who has been doing a job he hates and has now been relieved of it. He showed her everything he knew about the kitchen in about 20 minutes, which told her everything she needed to know about the state it had been in. She didn't overhaul it all at once. She was smarter than that. She'd seen what happened when someone came into an established place and started immediately rearranging everything. According to her own preferences, it generated resistance even when the changes were objectively better, because people's relationship to their routines was about more than efficiency. So she started with the things that mattered most and were least visible: the storage arrangement, the timing of the prep work, the order in which things got done, so that nothing was rushed and nothing was wasted. Within 3 days, the food was noticeably better. Within a week, it was a different operation. Not because she was doing anything miraculous, she was doing what she always did, which was work carefully and pay attention and remember what she learned, but because the kitchen had been running so badly for so long that any real attention was a dramatic improvement. She learned the men's names by the end of the first week. Not just their names, but the actual texture of who they were, who had a bad knee that made him slower in the mornings, who was trying to save money to send to a family back in Kansas, who had a sweet tooth he was embarrassed about, who had trouble with the coffee if it was too strong. None of them told her these things directly, she observed, and she asked careful questions. She remembered what she learned, and within a week, she was adjusting the meals in small ways that most of the men didn't consciously notice, but that made them feel, in some wordless way, that the kitchen was a place that knew them. That was what she'd always been good at. Not the cooking itself, though the cooking was real. The thing underneath the cooking, the attention, the memory, the willingness to treat each person's ordinary needs as worth knowing. She didn't see much of Caleb in those first 2 weeks. He was there, she heard him in the mornings and saw him crossing the yard, and sometimes caught a glimpse of him at the far end of the supper table, but he didn't come into the kitchen and he didn't seek her out. She understood this as intentional and correct. He had offered her a job in a space and then stepped back to let her find her footing in it, which was exactly the opposite of what Walter Crowe had done, and the contrast was so striking that she kept returning to it in quiet moments, turning it over. On the 15th day, she was alone in the kitchen in the early morning, starting the bread for the day, when he came in through the back door with snow on his coat and a look on his face that said he'd been out since, before the sun came up. She poured a mug of coffee without being asked, and set it on the counter near where he was taking off his coat. He saw it. He looked at her. He picked it up. "Fence line's down on the north quarter," he said. 3 head got out into the timber. We found them, but it's going to be a long day. How many men do you need on it?" He looked at her with a slight expression that she couldn't quite read. "Why?" "Because if it's all of them, I'll adjust the noon meal so it holds, and they can eat when they're back. If it's half, I'll have something ready at the usual time for whoever's in." He looked at her for another moment. "Half," he said. "The other half will be in by noon." "All right," she said, and went back to the bread. He drank his coffee in the kitchen without talking, which she found she didn't mind. She had gotten used to working in the presence of silence and found it better than most conversation. After a while, he set the empty mug down and said, "The shelf right?" She kept working. "The shelf is right," she said. He put his coat back on and went out into the cold. She had been at Stone Ridge for 3 weeks when she learned the real scale of it. It came out in pieces. Not because Caleb was hiding it exactly, but because he talked about his work the way people talk about things they've lived with. So long they've stopped thinking of them as remarkable. The North Quarter he mentioned casually. The Eastern Grazing Tract he referenced in passing. The cattle count he gave Holt for a supply order that was 3 times higher than anything Raven Hollow had ever dealt with. It was Darnell Holt who finally said it plainly, in the way that people say things plainly when they assume the other person already knows. "He's one of the 3 biggest operations in the territory," Holt said, helping carry flour sacks from the storage to the kitchen. "Maybe 2. Depends on how you count the northern herds." Eliza set down what she was carrying. "The northern herds," she said carefully. "The ones he runs out of the second property." Up past the ridge, he looked at her. "You didn't know about the second property?" She looked back at him with the particular expression of someone deciding how much to show. "He doesn't talk about it much," Holt said, with the tone of a man who had just realized he may have said something he wasn't supposed to. "It's just he doesn't live like it, is all. Most men with what he has, you'd know it from across the room." She thought about the man who'd drunk his coffee in her kitchen for 10 minutes and then gone back out to fix a fence himself. She thought about the coat that was good but not new, the boots resold rather than replaced. She thought about the shelf. She went back to work and didn't say anything to Holt, but she filed it away in the part of her mind that kept track of what things actually meant. That evening she found Caleb at the table in the main room going through a set of papers, which he did most evenings after supper. She had learned his routines the same way she'd learned everyone else's, by paying attention without making it obvious. She set a plate next to him and said without preamble, "Holt told me about the second property." He looked up. "He thought I already knew," she said. Caleb looked at her for a moment. "Did you want to know sooner?" She thought about that. I'm not sure, she said honestly. I think I wanted to understand this place before I understood how much of it there was. He looked at her with the expression she had started to think of as his real expression, not closed, not guarded, but careful, thoughtful. The expression of a man who chose his words the way a person in careful circumstances chooses his footing. Most people, he said, when they find out they start behaving differently. How differently? He picked up his fork. Careful, he said. Impressed. Trying to be useful in ways they weren't before. He paused. Or resentful sometimes. Because they feel like they've been misled about what they were agreeing to. She looked at him. Are you asking which one I am? I'm wondering, he said. She sat down across from him, which was not something she usually did. She ate in the kitchen by herself, which was her preference. None of those, she said. I'm the same as I was last week. The kitchen doesn't change, because there's more land attached to the house. He looked at her steadily for a moment. Good, he said. And he went back to his papers. She went back to the kitchen. But she stayed with that conversation for a long time afterward, his word for what happened when people found out. Careful. She understood that. She understood what it was like to move through the world in a way that made other people decide, before you even opened your mouth, how they were going to behave around you, what they were going to say and what they were going to leave out. She had done it herself with Walter, carefully, for 3 years. She hadn't thought about what it might feel like from the other direction. Walter Crow came to Stone Ridge on a Thursday in the second week of February. She knew it was him before she saw him. She heard a voice in the front room that had a particular quality. She recognized that patient, reasonable tone that meant someone was about to say something unreasonable in a way designed to make the listener feel like they were the problem. She stayed in the kitchen. She heard Caleb's voice, lower, saying something she couldn't make out. Then she heard Walter say, clearly enough, she left without proper notice. She owes me for the week, and I have reason to believe she took property of the station. There was a silence. Eliza set down the bread she was shaping and wiped her hands on her apron and stood still for a moment, deciding. Then she pushed through the kitchen door into the front room. Walter looked at her, with the expression he always wore, when he thought he had a point to make. Eliza, he said, in the tone of a man talking to a child who has made a predictable mistake. Walter, she said, you left without the appropriate notice, he said. 2 weeks as we discussed when you started. We didn't discuss 2 weeks, she said. You told me 2 weeks, I never agreed to it. And there was nothing in writing. There doesn't need to be. You're right, there doesn't, she said, because there's nothing owed. I gave you what I had given you every other week. Labor for pay. The pay stopped covering the labor a long time ago. Walter turned toward Caleb. I'd appreciate it if you'd tell your employee to. She's not going to stop talking, Caleb said. His voice was even. Not raised, not particularly hard, just clear, in the way that something is clear when it isn't going to be moved. Walter looked at him. You drove here 40 miles in February to collect 2 weeks of wages from a woman who no longer works for you, Caleb said. That's your choice. But you came onto my property to do it, so we're going to do it honestly. You'll say what you have to say, and she'll say what she has to say, and then you'll get back on your horse. Walter's jaw tightened. I have standing. You have nothing documented, Caleb said, and no legal position, and you know it. If you had a real claim, you'd have gone to the magistrate, not come here yourself. There was a silence. Walter looked at Eliza with the expression of a man recalculating what he thought he was dealing with. She'd seen that expression before on Walter, on men like him, and she recognized the moment it was happening. The moment when the version of her he'd constructed in his mind hit the version of her that was actually standing in front of him, and the collision was too significant to ignore. You were a good worker, he said, as though this were a concession. I know, she said. There's no need for this to be. You came here, she said, not me. Another silence. Walter picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Eliza. He went through some private calculations she didn't have access to and didn't particularly need. Well, he said finally in the voice of a man choosing to interpret defeat as departure on his own terms. I can see there's nothing more to discuss. He left. The front room was quiet. Caleb stood near the window, not quite watching through it. Not quite not. Eliza stood near the kitchen doorway with her apron still on and her hands at her sides. He'll find a way to make it into a different story, she said. Most likely, Caleb said. He'll tell people I stole from him, or that I was dismissed. Let him, Caleb said. People who know what they're talking about know where to find you. People who don't aren't the ones you need. She looked at him. He was still standing near the window, not looking at her, looking at the middle distance in the way of a man who has said what he thinks is true, and isn't currently worrying about whether it landed right. She went back to the kitchen. She finished the bread. She thought about what he'd said for a long time. After people who know what they're talking about know where to find you, and found that it sat differently from most things people had said to her by way of reassurance. It sat like something that was true, rather than something that was kind, and she had learned by now that the difference between those two things was significant. The snow started on a Wednesday in the third week of February and didn't stop. Not that day, not the next. By Friday morning, it had become the kind of storm that changes how a ranch runs, not by shutting it down, but by compressing every decision into a shorter window and a higher cost of error. Pipes could freeze, animals could drift into exposed terrain. Supplies could become inaccessible if you didn't move them before the paths became unnavigable. Eliza woke at 3 on Friday morning because she heard something that wasn't right. Not a loud sound, a small one. A shift in the way the building was settling. A change in the air pressure that told her the temperature had dropped significantly in the past few hours. She got up and went to the kitchen and started the stove, and then stood at the window and looked out at the dark and the snow and tried to think about what the ranch needed. She had been at Stone Ridge for 8 weeks. She had spent those 8 weeks paying attention with the same focused discipline she'd applied to everything else. She knew where the water lines ran because she'd needed to know for the kitchen, and in learning that she'd followed them far enough to understand the whole system. She knew where the snow would accumulate on the north side of the stable because she'd watched it for 6 weeks. She knew which of the storage areas could be reached after a significant snowfall and which would be cut off, because she'd thought about it as a contingency the same way she thought about every contingency in a kitchen before it became one. She made a list. On a piece of paper from the counter, with a pencil from her apron pocket, she wrote down the things that needed to happen in the next 4 hours in order of importance, based on what she knew about the layout of the ranch and the location of the animals and the supplies that mattered most. Then she sat and drank coffee in the dark kitchen and waited for the first sign of movement from the bunkhouse. Caleb appeared at the kitchen door at 4:30. He looked at her, at the lamp, the coffee, the piece of paper on the counter, with a particular expression that she had started to recognize as the expression he wore when something hadn't gone as expected in a way that interested him. "You've been up," he said. "Sit down," she said, and pushed the paper across the counter to him. "The pipes on the north line are going to be the first problem, probably within the hour. The cattle in the east pasture are going to drift toward the timber if nobody moves them before the wind picks up, and it's going to pick up around 9 based on how the pressure's been changing. The storage shed near the far stable can still be reached if someone goes now, but not in 2 hours. He looked at the list. He read it carefully. He looked up at her. "How do you know about the north line?" he said. "I asked Holt about the water system the first week," she said. "I needed to know what happened to the kitchen supply if there was a problem. He showed me more than I asked for." Caleb looked at the list again. Then he stood up and took his coat from the hook near the door and started putting it on. "I'll wake Holt and Morrison first," he said. "Then Garrett for the east pasture. If you go for the east pasture yourself, Garrett can handle the far stable," she said. "He's faster on horseback." He paused with one arm in the coat sleeve and looked at her. "You know Garrett's faster on horseback than you," she said matter-of-factly. "He's 10 years younger and he grew up in the territory. Use that." Caleb looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not offended, not amused. Something in between that had a quality she couldn't translate into a word she already knew. "All right," he said. He finished putting on the coat. "Can you keep the kitchen going through the storm? We're going to need something hot and ready whenever men come in." "That's what I'm here for," she said. He went out into the dark and the snow. She turned back to the stove. What followed was one of the longest days she could remember since the worst nights at Raven Hollow, and it was different from those nights in every way that mattered. At Raven Hollow, she'd worked through difficulty alone, and the difficulty had been Walter's incompetence and exploitation. Here, the difficulty was real and external: the storm, the cold, the livestock, the systems under pressure, and she was one part of a larger effort to hold something together that was worth holding. Men came in through the morning and afternoon cold to the point of clumsiness, covered in snow, exhaling visible breath. She had food ready. She had dry wool in a stack near the stove. She had figured out early that a man who'd been working in the cold for 4 hours didn't want to be asked questions. He wanted to be handed something hot and left alone for 10 minutes, and she had arranged the kitchen accordingly. She lost track of how many times the back door opened. She stopped counting at 14. Caleb came in twice during the day, once in the morning to report that the east pasture cattle had been moved and the north pipe situation was manageable, once in the early afternoon with a cut on his right hand from a wire fence that had given way unexpectedly. She wrapped it without comment because comment would have been unnecessary, and he wouldn't have wanted it. "You're going to want to get Morrison to look at that tonight," she said, meaning the hand. Morrison was the oldest hand on the ranch and had enough field experience with injuries to serve as the closest thing Stone Ridge had to medical attention. "It's fine," Caleb said. "It will be fine if you get it looked at tonight," she said without changing her tone. It won't be fine if you wait. He looked at her. I'm not arguing about it, she said. I'm just telling you. He ate what she'd put in front of him and went back out. That evening, after the worst of the storm had moved east and the damage assessment had been completed, and the animals were accounted for, and the men were back in the bunkhouse warming up, she sat alone in the kitchen for the first time all day. Her feet ached. Her back ached. She had not sat down since 3 in the morning. She poured herself a cup of coffee from what was left in the pot and sat down at the counter and looked at the piece of paper she'd made the list on, now covered in pencil marks where she'd crossed off items throughout the day. Everything on the list had been done, mostly in the order she'd written it. The ranch had come through the storm with no permanent losses, some fence damage, a tool shed that had partially collapsed, 2 cattle that had been retrieved from the timber with minor injuries. It could have been much worse. In other years, Holt had told her, similar storms had cost the ranch significantly more. She sat with that for a while. Then the back door opened and Caleb came in. He looked like a man who'd spent 16 hours in a December snowstorm, which is to say, he looked exactly as rough as that should look and didn't seem particularly concerned about it. He stopped when he saw her at the counter. Morrison looked at it, he said, holding up his right hand briefly to indicate the wrap job Morrison had done on it, which was adequate, if not elegant. Good, she said. He went to the stove and poured himself the last of the coffee, which was by that point about 4 hours past its best state, and drank it anyway. He stood at the counter not quite across from her and looked at his coffee for a moment. The list you made this morning, he said. She waited. It was correct, he said, in order. Everything on it was correct. I paid attention, she said. He looked up at her. Eliza, he said. I've had ranch hands who've been here 5 years and couldn't have made that list. She looked back at him. They weren't running the kitchen, she said. The kitchen touches everything. You pay attention to the kitchen and you end up knowing things that aren't on the surface. He nodded slowly, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Still, he said. Still, she agreed. It wasn't a compliment in the way Walter Crow's occasional thin praises had been compliments, the kind that were really just observations about how well his own investment was performing. It was a statement of fact from a man who dealt in facts and knew the difference between what should have happened and what had actually happened. She finished her coffee. She stood up. I'm going to the cabin, she said. The bread for tomorrow is shaped and covered. It just needs the oven in the morning. I know, he said. She put on her coat. She wrapped her hands. She took the lamp from the hook by the door. She paused with her hand on the door. The fence on the east side of the north quarter, she said, not turning around. The post at the far corner was already loose before the storm. I noticed it 2 weeks ago. It should be looked at before the next snowfall or the repair from today won't hold. A pause. I'll tell Garrett, he said. She nodded and went out into the cold. The snow had stopped. The sky had cleared. And it was the kind of clear that only happens after a storm absolute, with stars that look close enough to touch, if you were the sort of person who reached for things. She was not generally that sort of person, but she stood for a moment in the stillness between the main house and the cabin and looked up at them anyway. She had survived the storm. The ranch had survived the storm. And somewhere between the moment she'd gotten up at 3 in the morning and made the list, and this moment, standing in the cold with the lamp and the night quiet around her, something in her understanding of what this place was and what she was to it had shifted into a new position. She didn't put a name on it yet. She had learned not to name things too early. Names made you committed in ways you hadn't fully worked out yet, and she liked to be sure of what she was committed to before she said the word for it. But she looked up at those stars for a long moment. She thought, 8 weeks ago I was washing plates in Raven Hollow at 10 o'clock at night, with coins in my pocket that someone had taken out of my hand. She thought, look at what a person can find when they stop staying in the wrong place long enough to walk out of it. Then she went inside and banked the stove and took off her boots and was asleep in 2 minutes, the way a person sleeps when they've spent 16 hours doing something that mattered. The fence post Eliza had mentioned held through February, but gave out on the first genuinely warm day of March, when the ground thawed faster than anyone expected, and the soil around the base let go all at once. Garrett found it before any cattle got through, which meant the warning had done its job, and he told Caleb about it with a specificity that made clear he understood exactly who had flagged it and when. Caleb had it repaired by noon. He didn't mention it to Eliza directly, but the following morning there was a new oil lamp on the shelf above the kitchen counter, better quality than the old one, which had a crack in the chimney that made it burn unevenly. She noticed it. She didn't say anything about it. She filled it and trimmed the wick and lit it at 4 o'clock when she started the morning prep, and the kitchen was brighter for it, and that was the whole of the exchange. That was how things worked between them increasingly, not in words. In actions that were precise enough to function as words for anyone paying attention. March brought more mud than snow, which was its own category of difficulty on a working ranch. Everything took longer when the ground was soft, the horses moved differently. The supply wagons bogged down. The paths between buildings became something between a trail and a problem. The men came in at the end of the day with boots caked past the ankle and a particular kind of exhausted that wasn't just physical, the kind that accumulated when every simple task had been made harder than it should have been for 30 days running. Eliza adjusted without being asked. She started keeping a basin of hot water and a rough towel near the back door. She started making the noon meal heavier on days when the forecast looked bad, because a man who'd eaten well at noon worked better in the afternoon than one who'd had something light and was running on cold and stubbornness by 3 o'clock. She started learning which men had particular physical vulnerabilities, a shoulder that went bad in the cold, a knee that swelled in wet weather, and adjusting what she put in front of them in small ways that she'd never have been able to explain if anyone asked her to articulate the system. Because the system was just attention, which was not something you could write down in a way that made it look like what it was. The ranch began to feel different. Not dramatically. Nothing dramatic happened in March, which was a month defined by the slow, unremarkable work of getting through the end of winter. But in the way that a room feels different when someone who understands it has been in it for a while. Everything's still in the same place, but the arrangement making more sense than it used to. She noticed this in the men most clearly. They had started to talk in the kitchen. Not to her necessarily, or not only to her, but to each other in the kitchen in a way they hadn't before. The kitchen had been a functional space before she arrived, a place where food came from and things got cleaned. It had started to become something else, the way certain rooms do when they're tended to by someone who understands that a room can hold people as well as objects if you let it. Holt was the first to actually sit down in there uninvited. He showed up one evening about an hour after supper when she was doing the last of the prep for the morning, and stood in the doorway in the way of a large man who wasn't sure he was welcome and hadn't quite decided whether to commit to entering. "You need something?" she said, not stopping what she was doing. "No," he said. He looked at the counter. He looked at the stove. Just stopped. She waited. "It smells good in here," he said, which was not what he'd been going to say, and they both knew it, but she let it stand. "There's bread cooling on the rack," she said. "It's for tomorrow, but the end piece is spare." He came in and got the end piece and sat down at the small table near the window and ate it without talking. She finished the prep. After a while, he said, "You hear from your family? Where you came from?" She looked at him. "No family to speak of," she said. "You?" "Mother in Missouri," he said. "2 sisters. He ate the last of the bread. Send money when I can." She nodded. "You ever think about going back?" "Wherever it was." She thought about that honestly for a moment. "No," she said. "There wasn't much to go back to." He nodded in the way people nod when they understand that without needing it explained. He got up and put his plate in the basin and said good night, and went back to the bunkhouse, and after that he came back most evenings, and then other men started coming after him, and the kitchen in the evening became a place where people ended up without quite deciding to, the way warmth draws people when they're cold. Caleb watched this happen. She knew he watched it, because she caught him in the doorway of the front room once, looking through at the kitchen, where Holt and Garrett and a young hand named Perez were sitting with their coffee after supper, talking about something she wasn't following, and the expression on his face was the quiet, private one she associated with him, registering something he hadn't anticipated. She went on doing what she was doing. Spring arrived in pieces, the way it always did in that part of the territory, one warm day, then a cold snap, then 2 warm days, then rain that felt like it couldn't decide whether it wanted to be snow. The cattle started moving differently when the grass came in on the eastern flats, and the whole rhythm of the ranch shifted in the subtle way that a ranch's rhythm shifts when the land is telling it something. Caleb started riding the property every morning. Not every morning he'd always ridden regularly, but with a different purposefulness in spring, going out to assess the grazing and the water and the fence lines and the accumulated damage of winter with the same methodical attention she'd seen him apply to everything else. He came back each morning with an update for whoever needed to know about fence repairs or herd positioning or the state of the creek crossing on the north section. He started stopping at the kitchen to tell her, not in an official way, not in the way of a man reporting to his head cook, in the way of a man who was in the habit of stopping somewhere on the way from one thing to the next because the stopping had become part of how the morning worked. She would be at the stove or at the counter, and he would come in and pour his own coffee because he'd stopped waiting for her to do it, and she'd stopped offering, and he'd say something like, "Creek's running high on the north section. If we get another week of melt, we're going to have to move the lower herd earlier than usual." And she would say something like, "The flour order's coming through town next Thursday." If you need a hand going up to get it, I'd rather go Thursday morning than afternoon, because of the weather pattern. And he would say, I'll send Garrett Thursday morning. And she would nod and go back to what she was doing. It was the most ordinary kind of conversation, entirely practical. The kind of thing that two people running a large operation together said to each other because it was necessary and efficient, and they were both people who valued efficiency. She told herself it was that and only that, and most of the time she believed it because she was genuinely busy and she had learned not to build stories about things before they'd shown her what they actually were. But she noticed that he stopped at the kitchen on mornings when there was nothing specific to report. She noticed that the stopping was the thing, and the reporting was the reason for it. She noticed, and she didn't say anything, because neither did he, and she had developed enough respect for his pace to match it. The trouble started in April. It came in the form of a man named Reston, first name Thomas, which he didn't use, who arrived at Stone Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon, with a letter of introduction from a cattle broker in Cheyenne, and a way of looking at the ranch that was too thorough to be casual. He said he was assessing ranches in the territory for a land investment concern based in the East. He said he was interested in Stone Ridge as a potential acquisition. He said this in the front room to Caleb in a tone that made acquisition sound like an honor being extended rather than a transaction being proposed. Eliza was in the kitchen. The kitchen door was open enough that she could hear without being visible. Caleb said, Stone Ridge isn't for sale. Reston said he understood that and wasn't asking for a decision today, just an opportunity to have a conversation about the value of the property and what a serious offer might look like. Caleb said he wasn't interested in having that conversation either. Reston's voice went careful in a way that was different from polite. Mr. Thornton, I want to be straightforward with you. The concern I represent has significant interests in this territory. Properties that are part of our portfolio do very well. Properties that aren't sometimes find themselves at a disadvantage when it comes to water access and regional supply agreements. The kitchen went very quiet. Eliza set down the knife she'd been using. Caleb's voice, when it came, was entirely level. Are you telling me that if I don't sell, there will be interference with my water rights or supply lines? I'm telling you, Reston said, that the territory is changing. The concerns that have relationships with the major distribution networks tend to fare better than those that don't. A silence. You've said what you came to say, Caleb said. I'll ask you to leave now. Another pause. I'll be in the area for another week, Reston said, if you want to talk. She heard the front door close. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and then went back to what she was doing, because there was bread that needed attention, and it didn't help anything for her to stand still. Caleb came into the kitchen 10 minutes later. He poured his coffee and stood at the counter and looked at the wall for a moment in the way of a man working through something he's not yet ready to put into words. You heard, he said. It wasn't a question. The door was open, she said. Yes. He drank his coffee. The concern he's talking about, I know who they are. They've been moving through the territory for the past 8 months. 3 ranches have sold. 2 didn't. And they've had problems with their water access since. She thought about that. What kind of problems? The upstream parcels they've been counting on for years have suddenly had their agreements renegotiated. New owners with different terms. She looked at him. Can they do that? Legally, yes, if the agreements weren't properly documented, which most of them weren't, because they were handshake arrangements going back 20 years. He set down the mug. Stone Ridge's water access is documented. It was one of the first things I had written formally when I expanded the operation. But that doesn't mean there aren't other ways to make things difficult, she thought. The supply agreement with the Casper distributor, she said. He looked at her. Holt mentioned it when I was working out the flour order. It's verbal, isn't it? Not in writing. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, if Reston's concern gets to the distributor first, I know, he said. She thought about it the way she thought about kitchen problems practically, in terms of what could be done rather than what was wrong. Who do you have in town that you trust? A lawyer named Ardell. He's been handling my property documentation for 6 years. Can he get the supply agreement in writing before the end of this week? Caleb looked at her with an expression that was halfway between surprised and something else she didn't have a word for. I'd have to ride in tomorrow. Then you should ride in tomorrow, she said. He looked at her for another moment. You're right, he said. He pushed off from the counter and picked up his coat from the hook. I'll leave first light. I'll have something ready you can take on the road, she said, already planning it. You'll make better time if you don't have to stop in Milford. He paused at the door. Eliza. She looked up. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something more. Then he said, I should have thought of the supply agreement myself. You were thinking about the water rights, she said. You can't think about everything at once. He nodded. No, he said. That's exactly right. And he left. She stayed in the kitchen, thinking. She had learned enough about Stone Ridge in 3 months to understand what it would mean for the ranch if Reston's concern got a foothold here. It wasn't just Caleb's property at stake, it was 60 men's livelihoods, the supply arrangements that kept 3 local businesses running, the families that relied on Stone Ridge's operations through the winter months when other work dried up. It was a whole small ecosystem built around a thing that was run correctly, and she had seen enough of what happened to those ecosystems when they were taken apart by people who wanted the asset but not the obligation. She had seen it on a smaller scale with Walter. She understood the pattern. She started making something for Caleb to take on the road in the morning and thought about what else she knew, what else she'd noticed in 3 months of paying attention that might matter in a fight of this kind. Caleb was back from town by Thursday evening with the supply agreement signed and witnessed, which was the first piece. Ardell had also, on Caleb's instruction, pulled the existing documentation on the water rights and confirmed that they were solid enough to withstand a legal challenge, but had recommended a formal survey of the upstream parcels just in case. Reston came back on Friday. Eliza was in the kitchen when she heard him arrive, and this time she didn't stay in the kitchen. She dried her hands and went to the front room doorway and stood there, which she had every right to do in her own in the ranch's kitchen doorway. Reston looked at her briefly and dismissed her in about a quarter second in the way that men of his type dismissed anyone who wasn't the decision-maker in the room. Caleb saw her in the doorway and didn't tell her to leave, which told her everything she needed to know about where she stood. Reston made his pitch more explicitly this time, numbers, a figure that was, she could tell from Caleb's expression, not a low one. A description of what the concern would do with the property consolidated with adjacent holdings to create a more efficient regional operation, which was a way of saying they would take it apart and use the pieces for something that had nothing to do with what Stone Ridge actually was. Caleb listened with his hands in his lap and his face completely quiet. Then he said, "No." Reston's expression went to the particular place that entitled men's expressions go when they've been declined and haven't expected it. "Mr. Thornton, the figure I've named?" "I heard the figure," Caleb said. "My answer is the same." "There will be complications," Reston said. "For operations your size in this territory, the next few years are going to require relationships that—" "I have a lawyer who handles my relationships with the territory," Caleb said. "If you have a legal position, talk to him. If you don't, we're done here." Reston stood. He looked around the room in the slow way of a man marking territory he intends to come back to. His gaze landed on Eliza in the doorway and stayed there for a moment, in a way that was meant to be unsettling, a reminder that she was peripheral, that she was there only because someone allowed her to be. She looked back at him with the expression she had spent 3 years developing in Walter Crow's dining room, entirely neutral, entirely present, entirely unmoved. Reston left. The front room was quiet again. Caleb sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the table. He looked like a man holding a weight that wasn't yet heavy enough to be unbearable but had been added to, and he was recalculating what the total was going to come to. "He'll be back," she said. "Yes, or someone else will." "Also yes." She came into the room fully and sat down across from him, which she did rarely and deliberately. "What's the documentation situation on the Eastern Tract?" "The second property." He looked up. "Solid. Ardell handled it when I acquired it." "And the grazing leases on the federal sections?" A pause. "Those are newer, filed correctly." "But newer," she thought. "Ardell should look at those. I'll send him the paperwork next week." "This week," she said. "Reston is going to look for the soft place in the fence. That's what people like him do. They don't hit where it's strong." Caleb looked at her steadily. "You know his type." "I worked for his type for 3 years," she said, "on a much smaller scale. But the method is the same. They look for what's informal, what's assumed, what everyone's been counting on without checking." He was quiet for a moment. "And the fix is making the informal formal." "The fix is not giving them anything to work with," she said. He nodded slowly. "All right," she got up. "The paperwork goes to Ardell by Wednesday." "By Wednesday," he agreed. She went back to the kitchen. She was not an attorney, and she was not a rancher, and there were large parts of this problem that were entirely outside her knowledge and her authority. But she understood the shape of predatory behavior because she'd lived under it, and she understood the architecture of informal arrangements and how they could be used against you, and she understood that the most useful thing a person could do when they saw a threat coming was to make whatever it was coming for as solid as possible before it arrived. She had done it for herself, eventually. She could do it here. The weeks that followed were tense in the particular way that problems you can't see clearly are tense not with obvious drama, but with the sustained vigilance of waiting for something to show its shape. Reston's concern made their move in May, and it was not where Caleb had expected it. It came through a man named Caldwell, who ran the regional freight operation that supplied most of the large ranches in the Eastern Territory. Caldwell informed Caleb through a letter that was almost apologetic in its phrasing that due to changes in his business arrangements, the freight route through Stone Ridge would be suspended for the foreseeable future. The freight route carried the lumber and equipment that Stone Ridge needed for its summer expansion, specifically the materials to build 2 new structures that Caleb had been planning since January, including an expanded stable and a secondary bunkhouse for the increased hands he'd contracted for the busy season. Without the materials, the construction couldn't start. Without the construction, the additional hands had nowhere to stay, which meant the busy season contracts couldn't be filled, which meant a significant loss in the fall cattle drive. Caleb showed Eliza the letter on a Thursday morning. He didn't explain what it meant. She read it and worked out the implications herself in about 2 minutes. "Is there another freight operation?" she said. "There's one out of Milford, but they're smaller. They can't carry the full load." "Can they carry half?" he considered. "Probably." "And is there anyone else?" "Independent haulers. Suppliers who do their own freight?" he thought. "There's a man named Birch who hauls between the northern settlements in town. He's not set up for large operations, but he's reliable." "Birch plus the Milford operation," she said. He looked at the letter. "It's going to cost more. The 2-route arrangement isn't efficient." "It's more than a single route costs," she said. "It's less than a failed construction season." She set the letter on the counter. "And you should write to Caldwell, not to argue, to ask who his new business arrangement is with. He won't tell you, but the fact that you asked and that you wrote it down matters." He looked at her. "Why does it matter if he doesn't answer?" "Because it creates a record," she said, "that you knew what was happening and asked formally. If this ends up in front of anyone legal, you want a record of exactly when you knew what." He was quiet for a moment. "You think it's going to get legal," he said. "I think Reston came here with a strategy and you said no. And the strategy is still running," she said. "I don't know how far it goes, but it's not done." He put his coffee down and looked at the wall. He had the expression of a man who is neither panicking nor pretending everything is fine, just carrying the actual weight of the thing and working out what comes next. "I'll contact Birch today," he said, "in Milford. I'll rework the supply schedule on my end," she said. "If the construction is delayed by a month, I need to plan around that for the summer hands' arrival." He nodded. He picked up his coat. "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "Reston came here because Stone Ridge is worth coming for," she said. "That's the thing to remember when this gets harder. They don't do this to operations that aren't worth taking." He looked at her. "It doesn't make it easier," she said. "But it's the truth." "No," he said, "it doesn't make it easier." But something in his face had settled slightly. "Thank you," he said. She waved it off and went back to the counter. He left. May turned and June came in with heat that was a different animal entirely from what the territory had been showing since January. The summer hands began arriving in the second week of June, men who worked the seasonal circuit, coming up from the south as the grazing season shifted north, experienced in the particular rhythms of large cattle operations and exactly as rough and particular in their requirements as Eliza had expected. There were 14 of them by the end of the first week, and the kitchen, which had been running at a steady pace for 60 people through the spring, suddenly needed to be a different kind of machine. She didn't sleep much that first week. Not because the work was beyond her, she had managed larger, but because the logistics of feeding that many men on an adjusted supply schedule, while the freight situation was still being sorted out, required the same kind of constant background calculation that she'd applied to keeping Raven Hollow running on Walter's inadequate provisions, and it occupied a part of her mind that didn't fully switch off even when she was technically resting. On the 4th night of that week, past midnight, she was sitting in the kitchen, going through the supply list by lamplight, when she heard the back door open. She looked up. Caleb stood in the doorway, still dressed, with the expression of a man who had been trying to sleep and had given up. He looked at her at the table with the lamp and the papers. "You can't sleep either," he said. "Supply calculations," she said. He came in and sat down across from her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just sat there in the lamplight in the quiet kitchen and looked at the wall. She kept working through the list. After a while, he said, "Birch is confirmed for the second freight route. Milford is covering the lumber. It's going to work out." "Good," she said. "The schedule's going to slip by about 3 weeks on the south bunkhouse." "I know, I adjusted the hand arrangements already." He nodded. He looked at her papers. "Is it manageable? The kitchen with the extra hands?" "Yes," she said. "It's a lot, but it's manageable." "You'd tell me if it wasn't," she looked up. "Yes," she said. "I would." He held her gaze for a moment, and in the quiet of the kitchen in the middle of the night, with the lamp between them and the list half finished on the table, there was something in the air that was different from what was usually in the air between them. Not uncomfortable, not unexpected exactly. More like something that had been building at such a gradual pace that neither of them had tracked the accumulation. And now, in this particular moment, they were both aware of where the accumulation had gotten to. She looked back at the list. He said, "You've been here 6 months." "Almost," she said. "Is it what you expected?" She thought about that honestly. "No," she said, "it's harder than I expected. And better." He was quiet for a moment. "Better how?" She kept her eyes on the paper, but she'd stopped actually working through the numbers. "It matters," she said. "What happens here? The choices I make, they actually affect things." She paused. "At Raven Hollow, I was just managing someone else's neglect. Here it's—" She stopped. "Different," he said. "Different," she agreed. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I want you to know," he said, and stopped. She waited. "When I hired you," he said, "I knew you were good at the work." "I didn't know." He stopped again, which was unusual for a man who generally said what he meant with reasonable efficiency. "I didn't know you were going to change the way this place runs. And I want you to know that I see that. Whatever you think of how things have gone, I see exactly what you've done here." She looked up at him. He looked back steadily, not performatively. Not the way Walter used to look at her when he was about to recalculate her value for his own purposes. Just directly, in the way of a person saying something true and meaning for it to land as true. She nodded once. "Thank you," she said. He stood up. He put his coffee cup in the basin. He said goodnight and went out of the kitchen and back through the house. She sat for a moment in the lamplight and the quiet. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to the supply list, because it still needed finishing, and 4 o'clock would come whether or not she was ready for it. But for the rest of that night, working through the numbers by lamplight, she was aware of something that she'd been only half aware of before, or had been aware of, but had been careful not to name. For the same reason, she was careful with most things, because naming it made it real, and real things could hurt you if they didn't work out the way you'd hoped. She thought 6 months. She thought maybe it's time to be less careful about this particular thing. And she wrote down the flower order for the 3rd week of June and moved on to the next item, because the list didn't care what she was thinking, and neither did the morning, and there was still a great deal of work to do before either of them arrived. The supply list she'd finished that night turned out to be the easy part of June. The harder part arrived 6 days later in the form of a letter addressed to Caleb from the Territorial Land Office formal paper, official seal, the kind of envelope that no one opens casually, because the weight of it alone tells you something has been set in motion that wasn't set in motion by you. Caleb read it at the table in the front room while Eliza was clearing the morning dishes, and she knew from the way he went still that it was Reston's work. A man who goes still like that when he reads something isn't surprised he's recognizing something he'd already half expected and had hoped wouldn't come. He set the letter on the table. She came and looked at it without being invited, because they were past the point where she needed an invitation for that. The letter stated that a formal survey challenge had been filed against the boundary documentation for Stone Ridge's Eastern Tract, the second property Holt had mentioned the day. Eliza learned the true scale of what Caleb owned. The challenge alleged that the original survey, conducted 11 years prior, had used markers that were no longer verifiable, and that the boundary as documented overlapped with a parcel that had recently been acquired by a land concern operating out of Cheyenne. She read it twice. Reston's concern, she said. Yes, they bought the adjacent parcel. Apparently. He turned the letter over as though there might be something on the back. There wasn't. The survey markers they're referring to, there was a fire in the eastern timber 9 years ago. Some of the original blazed trees burned. I had Ardell note that in the updated documentation, but we didn't resurvey at the time. Is the boundary actually where you say it is? Yes, he said. I've worked that line for 11 years. I know exactly where it runs. But the documentation has a gap. A gap Ardell flagged, but that we didn't address because it would have required a resurvey, and at the time there was no reason to think anyone was going to challenge it. She looked at the letter again. The deadline for responding to the challenge was 45 days from the date of filing, which had been 2 weeks ago. They had just under a month. Get Ardell today, she said. Not by letter. Write in, I was already planning to. Take the original survey documentation with you. Everything. It's in the strongbox in the office. And find out if there are any witnesses to the original survey. Any of the men who worked this property 11 years ago who could speak to where the boundary actually ran. He looked at her. That's a good thought. Holt's been here 7 years, she said. Who was here before him, Caleb thought. A man named Cassius Webb. He was my original foreman. He left in '83 to run his own operation up near the northern settlements. Can you reach him? I can try. He stood, already moving toward the office where the strongbox was. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Reston bought that parcel specifically because of the gap in your documentation, she said. It's not a coincidence. Someone told him where the weak point was, or he had someone look into every property he approached before he came calling. Either way, he knew before he walked through your door that this was the angle. Caleb stopped in the doorway. She could see him working through it, the sequence, the timing. Reston's visit in April, the freight disruption in May. Now this in June, not random inconveniences, a progression. He expected me to sell in April, Caleb said. When I didn't, he moved to the freight. When that didn't work, he filed the survey challenge, she said. Because it's the one that has real legal standing. The other moves were pressure. This one has teeth. He looked at her steadily. How do you know how this works? She thought about how to answer that. Walter used to talk about his competitors, she said. He liked talking about how people got pushed out of their positions. He thought it was funny. I listened. She paused. I didn't know I was learning anything. I was just listening, because there was nothing else to do. Caleb nodded slowly. Something moved across his face that she didn't try to interpret. Go get Ardell, she said. He went. The month that followed was the most demanding one Eliza had spent since the first winter at Raven Hollow, and it was demanding in a completely different way because it wasn't her crisis or wasn't only hers. And the difference between a person managing their own disaster and a person helping manage someone else's is that the second requires a kind of sustained, deliberate calm that doesn't come naturally when you care about the outcome. She cared about the outcome. She had known this for a while, but the 45-day deadline made it specific in a way that abstract caring doesn't. Ardell came to the ranch on a Thursday, which was unusual. He was a town man and preferred to conduct business in his office, but Caleb had apparently said something in their meeting that convinced him the situation warranted the trip. He was a small, precise man in his 60s, with the kind of face that had stopped being readable somewhere around his 40th year, which Eliza considered a professional asset in a lawyer. He brought 2 leather cases of documentation and spent an entire afternoon in the front room with Caleb and the original survey papers spread across the table. Eliza brought them coffee twice. She didn't stay to listen the first time. The second time, she set the coffee down and Ardell looked up at her and said, without particular ceremony, "You're the one who told him to write to Caldwell about the freight." She looked at him.
Yes.
"And you suggested documenting the supply agreement." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with his unreadable face. "Sit down," he said. She sat. Ardell explained the legal situation with the efficiency of a man who had explained complicated things to clients for 30 years and had developed a method for doing it without condescension or unnecessary drama. The survey challenge was legitimate, informed the filing was proper. The jurisdictional claim was correct. The reference gap in the documentation was real. What Reston's concern was betting on was that Caleb either couldn't establish the correct boundary without the destroyed survey markers, or couldn't do it within the response window. What they're not betting on, Ardell said, is a former foreman. Caleb had located Cassius Webb through a letter sent north 10 days earlier. Webb had written back in 4 days, which suggested he'd understood the urgency. He was listened to provide a sworn statement about the boundary as it had been established during his tenure. He had, it turned out, kept his own notes from the original survey, a working foreman's habit of writing down anything that touched the property lines, because boundary disputes were not rare, and a smart man kept records. Webb's statement plus his notes plus 2 additional witnesses I've identified who were present during the original survey gives us a strong evidentiary position, Ardell said. Not guaranteed, but strong. What's the weakness? Eliza said. Both men looked at her. There's always a weakness, she said. What is it? Ardell considered her for a moment. The weakness is time, he said. The response filing requires a formal resurvey by a licensed surveyor accepted by the Territorial Land Office. The Land Office has 2 surveyors on their approved list. One is currently committed to a federal project in the South. The other, he paused. The other has a prior relationship with the Cheyenne land concern that Reston represents. The room was quiet. How prior? Caleb said. He surveyed 2 of the properties they acquired last year, Ardell said. The ones whose owners sold rather than fight, Eliza thought. Is there a process for objecting to a surveyor on the basis of conflict of interest? Ardell looked at her with an expression that was the closest his face got to surprised. There is, he said, but it's rarely used. And using it buys time while the objection is considered, but doesn't guarantee. But it buys time, she said. It buys time, he confirmed. Then that's the first move, she said. File the conflict of interest objection against the second surveyor. While that's being considered, find a surveyor not on the land office list who would be willing to conduct a private survey and produce documentation that you can present as supporting evidence, even if it's not the official response. Ardell looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Eliza. She looked back at both of them steadily. I'm not a lawyer, she said. Tell me if I'm wrong. You're not wrong, Ardell said. He said it with a particular quality. The quality of a man acknowledging something that hadn't been in his plan when he rode out here this morning. It buys time and it produces a parallel record. It won't settle the challenge on its own, but combined with Webb's statement and witnesses, it gives us multiple lines of argument. Multiple lines are harder to defeat than one, she said. Yes. he said. They are. He gathered his papers. He told Caleb he would file the conflict of interest objection by Monday and begin the process of locating an independent surveyor. He put on his coat and picked up his cases and paused at the door. The kitchen, he said to Eliza. That's your role here? Yes, she said. He nodded slowly the way a person nods when a category they had assigned to something turns out to be the wrong category. Then he left. The front room was quiet. Caleb sat at the table with the papers still spread across it and looked at the door for a moment. I should have brought Ardell out here 2 months ago, he said. You brought him when you needed to, she said. I should have needed to sooner. He looked at the papers. If Reston had moved in March instead of June, we'd be in a worse position. But he didn't, she said, and we're not. He looked up at her. We, he said. She met his eyes. Yes, she said. We. It was the first time she'd used that word about Stone Ridge, and she heard it the same way he did, not as a slip, not as a figure of speech, but as a statement of something that had been true for a while and had finally been said out loud. She gathered the coffee cups and went back to the kitchen. July was the month the legal process moved at its own pace, which was slow, and the ranch moved at the pace the summer season demanded, which was not slow at all. These two things existed simultaneously, and the tension between them was a constant low hum underneath everything else. The conflict of interest objection had been filed and was being considered. The independent surveyor, a man out of Denver with 30 years of experience and no relationship with any land concern in the territory, had been retained and had completed his survey of the eastern tract boundary in the second week of July, producing documentation that confirmed the boundary exactly as Caleb had stated it. The survey had been sent to Ardell to be included in the formal response package. Cassius Webb's sworn statement had arrived by post and had been witnessed by the magistrate in the northern settlement where he lived. It was clear, specific, and directly contradicted the claim that the boundary was uncertain. He had attached his original working notes, 40 pages of careful pencil writing, dates and measurements and sketches of the terrain as it had looked in 1878, before the fire, before any of this had become a question. The case was building. It wasn't one. Ardell made sure Caleb understood that, but it was building in the right direction. In the meantime, Stone Ridge was in the thick of the summer work. The cattle drives that moved the herds between the seasonal grazing sections required continuous coordination, and the kind of long days that left men eating at irregular times and needing the kitchen to be flexible in ways it hadn't needed to be in the spring. Eliza had adapted the operation again. She'd started keeping a pot of something substantial on the stove at almost all hours during the drive weeks, so that a man who came in at 2 in the afternoon and a man who came in at 8 in the evening could both find something that hadn't been sitting long enough to be a problem. She lost weight in July. She didn't notice until the second week of August, when she caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror above the cabin washstand and registered that her face looked sharper than it had in December. She was working hard enough that eating felt like another task to fit in, rather than something she did because she wanted to. She started being more deliberate about it, which was harder than it sounds when you're the person responsible for everyone else's eating. Caleb noticed the way he noticed things, not immediately, not loudly, but accurately and at the right moment. He came into the kitchen on a Tuesday evening and set a plate on the counter near where she was working. On it was a piece of the roast she'd made for supper, properly served, with the side she would have chosen for herself. She looked at it. You made enough for everyone else, he said. You should have made enough for you too. I eat, she said. Sit down and eat, he said. Right now, she looked at him. Please, he said. She sat down and ate, and he leaned against the counter while she did, not watching her but present, in the way that someone's presence can be a form of making sure something happens without making it feel like enforcement. The food was her own cooking, and it was good, and she realized when she started eating how hungry she'd actually been, which told her she'd been ignoring it longer than one day. When she'd finished, she said, You didn't have to do that. I know, he said. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not used to someone paying attention to that. I know that too, he said. They looked at each other across the kitchen, and the thing that had been accumulating since December, since those 5 words at the end of a table in Raven Hollow, since a shelf built at the right height for a tin, since coffee before conversations about fence lines and midnight supply lists, and a front room where she'd sat across from a lawyer and said what she thought without anyone telling her to, that thing was entirely present in the room with them, and neither of them was pretending, and it wasn't. Eliza, he said. Don't say it tonight, she said. Not unkindly, not pushing him away, just accurately. Not when I'm tired and it's been a hard month and the case isn't settled. He looked at her. When it's settled, she said, say it then. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He said, all right. He left the kitchen. She sat at the counter for a few minutes after he was gone and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was a version of fear that wasn't about danger, but about the thing you're hoping for being real enough to lose. She had spent 3 years making herself smaller in Walter Crow's kitchen. She had spent 7 months making herself larger here, carefully, by increments, testing each new level of trust the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. She had gotten to a place where she was standing fully upright in her own life, which was harder than it sounded, because the habit of making yourself smaller for other people's comfort was a hard one to break. And now there was this man who had built a shelf at the right height and told her she had changed the way the ranch worked and said please when he wanted her to take care of herself, and the part of her that knew what she was feeling and had always known what she was feeling wanted very much for it to be as real as it seemed. She was afraid it might not be. She was more afraid it might be exactly what it seemed, and she'd spend the rest of her life wishing she'd been less careful. She washed the plate he'd brought her and put it away and went to the cabin and lay awake for about an hour, and then she slept. Ardell sent word in the 3rd week of August that the Territorial Land Office had ruled on the conflict of interest objection ruling in Caleb's favor, removing the second surveyor from the approved list for this case and allowing the response window to be extended by 30 days. Combined with the independent survey and Webb's statement and the 2 additional witness affidavits Ardell had secured, the response package was nearly complete. Reston made one more move. It came not through the legal process but through a visit, which surprised Eliza when she heard about it, because she had expected a man like Reston to stay behind the paper and the process once the legal route was underway. Instead, he appeared at Stone Ridge on a Wednesday morning in late August, alone, without the studied confidence he'd shown on his previous visits. Caleb told her about it that evening. She had not been there, she'd been in the supply room during his arrival, and Caleb hadn't sent for her, which was his right, but which she filed away to think about later. Reston had offered a compromise. He would drop the survey challenge in exchange for grazing rights to the contested section of the Eastern Tract, not ownership, just access for a period of 10 years. Caleb's had said no. Reston had then said something that Caleb recounted carefully, the way a person recounts something they want to get exactly right. He told me that I was being stubborn because of the woman who runs my kitchen, and that a man in my position shouldn't let personal arrangements affect business decisions. The kitchen was quiet. Eliza set down what she was holding. "What did you say to that?" she said. "I told him that Eliza Vane has better judgment about my business than anyone I've employed in 11 years, Caleb said, and that if she had any influence on my decision to decline his offer, it was because her judgment is worth more than his offer." She looked at him. He looked back. "And then I told him to leave," he said, and he left. She was quiet for a long moment. "He's not going to drop the challenge," she said. "No, but he's not going to win it either." Caleb set the paper he'd been holding on the counter. Ardell filed the formal response package yesterday. Webb's statement, the independent survey, both witness affidavits, the conflict of interest ruling. He says the land office should reach a decision within 3 weeks. She nodded. "Eliza," he said. She looked up. "I meant what I said to him," he said. I want you to know, that wasn't just a way of dismissing his point. I meant it." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He nodded once. He picked up his coat. "When this is settled," he said. It wasn't a question. "When this is settled," she agreed. He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and then went back to work, because there was work and it wasn't going to do itself. And she was not someone who waited for life to happen around her. The land office decision came on a September morning, with the smell of the first real autumn cold beginning to build in the air. Ardell brought it himself, which told her it was good news before she read a word of it. A lawyer who brings bad news sends a letter. The challenge was dismissed. Stone Ridge's documentation was found sufficient to establish the Eastern Tract boundary as filed. The survey conducted by Reston's concern was found to have overstated the overlap based on faulty reference points that failed to account for the terrain changes following the fire. The matter was closed. Caleb read the ruling at the front room table. He sat there for a moment after he finished reading, and she watched him from the kitchen doorway, the quiet exhale, the deliberate way he set the paper down, the expression of a man who has been holding a weight for 4 months and has just been allowed to put it down. Ardell shook his hand and said several things about the strength of the case and the unusual quality of the documentation and the value of Webb's statement, all of which were true and all of which Caleb received with appropriate acknowledgement. When Ardell left, the front room was quiet. Eliza walked in from the kitchen and sat down across from Caleb, same as she had in April when Reston first made his threat. She folded her hands on the table. He looked at her. "It's settled," she said. Something changed in his face. Not dramatically, not the way things changed in stories when the right moment arrived and everyone recognized it. Just a small shift in the set of his jaw, the quality of his eyes. Like a man deciding that the time for waiting was done and the time for being honest was here. "I was going to say it differently," he said. I had a version in mind. Say it however you want, she said. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. I've been running this ranch alone for 11 years, he said. I'm good at running it alone, I know how. But since December, he stopped, started again. The thing I noticed first was the biscuits, he said, which sounds like nothing. But it wasn't nothing, because the biscuits were the first thing I'd tasted in a long time that someone had made like it mattered. And I thought about who would make something like that, in a place like Raven Hollow, for people who weren't paying attention. And I thought it had to be someone who just did things right, because that was how they did things. Not for recognition, not because someone was watching. She was very still. I built the shelf before I was sure you'd come, he said. I built it because I was hoping you would, and I wanted you to have what you needed when you did. He paused. I should probably have led with that, but I wasn't sure it was the right thing to say to someone who'd just left a bad situation and might not have appreciated a man building things based on hope before he'd been given any reason for it. She looked at him for a long moment. It was the right thing to say, she said. It would have been the right thing then, and it's the right thing now. I know that now, he said. I didn't know it then. We didn't know each other then. No, he agreed. We didn't. The front room was warm. Outside, through the window, one of the hands was crossing the yard with a bucket, unhurried, going about the ordinary work of the afternoon. The ranch was running. It was going to keep running. The thing Reston had tried to take was still here, still whole, still theirs. That word again. She let it be there this time without pulling it back. What is it you want to say, she said. The version you had in mind. He looked at her steadily. I want to ask if you'd consider making this permanent, he said. Not just the kitchen, not just the position. I want you to be here in the way I want to build something with you, Eliza. Whatever that looks like to you, at whatever pace makes sense. I'm not asking you to decide everything tonight. She was quiet for a moment. You're asking me to stay, she said. I'm asking you to stay on your own terms, he said. Because that's the only way it makes sense. Anything else isn't what I want. She looked at him, at the man who had first asked who made the biscuits, who had ridden 40 miles to offer her something instead of taking something, who had built a shelf and said please and told a hostile man that her judgment was worth more than his offer. And she thought about all the ways she had been careful, and all the ways careful had served her, and the one way it hadn't, which was this. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. I'll stay. He exhaled, not dramatically. Just the breath of a man who has been waiting for something and has finally been given it. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she let him, and they sat like that for a moment, in the front room of Stone Ridge with the autumn light coming through the window, and the ranch running outside, and a year of accumulated trust between them that had been built the only way real trust could be. Built slowly, by two people who had each learned the hard way what it cost to give it to someone who didn't deserve it. She was the one who eventually stood up. I have to start supper, she said. I know, he said, but he held her hand for one more second before he let go. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the stove and looked at the shelf above the counter, the one he'd built in a different kitchen, in a different cabin, before she'd arrived, based on nothing but hope, and thought about what a person could build when they had enough time, and the right materials, and somebody who understood what they were actually trying to make. Then she started supper, because it was 4 o'clock and 60 people were going to be hungry, and the work didn't stop for anything. Not even the best moments, which was actually the thing she loved most about it, that it kept going, that it demanded the next thing, that there was always more to do. She started the stove and listened to the ranch outside and thought, well, she thought, this is what solid ground feels like. She thought, I had almost forgotten. The autumn that followed the land office decision was the first season Eliza spent at Stone Ridge without a crisis running underneath it. That turned out to be its own kind of adjustment. She had spent so long operating with a low continuous emergency at Raven Hollow it had been Walter. Here, it had been the storm, and then Reston, and then the legal fight that the absence of it felt strange in the way that silence feels strange to a person who has been living near a river. The noise had just been there so long that she'd stopped hearing it as noise, and when it stopped, she didn't feel peaceful so much as she felt the shape of the space where the noise had been. She filled it with work, which was what she always did. But the work felt different now. Not less demanding, if anything. She had more to manage as the fall brought the end-of-season cattle drives and the accounting and the preparations for winter that a ranch the size of Stone Ridge required in substantial volume. But the quality of the demanding had changed. She was building something rather than protecting something, and those two activities used the same hands but a completely different part of the mind. Caleb had not said anything more about the future since the afternoon in the front room when the decision came. He was not a man who said things and then kept repeating them to check whether they'd landed. He had said what he meant and she had answered, and they both understood that the understanding was real and didn't need maintenance. This was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him, the absence of performance in how he handled what mattered. He did not manage her feelings about them. He just moved through the world the same way he always had, and now she was part of that movement, and that was how it was. She was, in the practical reality of her daily life, still the head cook at Stone Ridge. She still woke at 4. She still managed the kitchen and the supply orders and the particular ecosystem of 60s-odd people's nutritional requirements and preferences and physical conditions. She still sat at the small table near the window in the evenings when the kitchen was cleaned and made her lists for the next day. What was different was that Caleb now sat across from her sometimes when she did it. Not every evening, not with ceremony. He would come in after his own work was done and pour coffee and sit and go through his own papers while she went through hers. And sometimes they talked about what was in front of them, and sometimes they didn't talk at all, and the silence between them was the particular quality of silence that two people produce when they've been in enough difficulty together, that they don't need to fill every moment with words to know the other one is there. She had not had that since her mother. She didn't say that to him. It wasn't the kind of thing she said out loud, but she carried it. The conversation that changed the shape of what came next happened on a Thursday in October in the kitchen, which was where most of their real conversations happened because it was her territory, and she was more herself in it than anywhere else. She had been experimenting with the sourdough starter, the one from the tin, the one from her mother's kitchen, the one she'd carried out of Raven Hollow tucked inside her coat, trying a different ratio that she'd been thinking about for months, but hadn't had the mental space to actually test. The result was on the cooling rack, and she was looking at it with the honest, critical eye she applied to her own work, which was unsparing. Caleb came in from outside and stopped when he saw what was on the rack. "New batch," he said. "Testing something," she said. "It's not right yet." He picked up one of the smaller pieces she'd cut. She always cut a test piece before she let anything cool fully, to check the interior structure, and tasted it. He said nothing for a moment. She looked at him. "It's close," she said. "The crumb isn't what I want. The hydration's off by something small. It tastes better than anything I've had in the last month," he said. "The last month has been a busy month," she said. "That's a low bar." He set the piece down and looked at the rack. "How long have you been working on this?" "In my head, since March." She wiped her hands. "Actually doing it, this is the 3rd test." He looked at her with the specific expression he had when he was about to say something he'd been holding for a while. She had learned to recognize it. The slight stillness before a considered statement. "What would it take," he said, "to sell it?" She looked at him. "Sell the bread? Not just the bread, what you do." He leaned against the counter. "There are 3 towns within 40 miles of here that have no real bakery. Milford's got a woman who makes cornbread out of her house on Tuesdays. That's the closest thing in the region." She looked at the rack and thought about it in the practical, sequential way she thought about most things. The supply requirements, the volume, the timing against her existing kitchen responsibilities. "The kitchen here comes first," she said, "obviously." She said, "I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm suggesting that what you're making here is already more than this kitchen needs, and if you had a way to get it to the towns that are missing it, I'd need a dedicated oven," she said. "Yes, and a delivery arrangement. The supply wagons go to Milford twice a month, more often in the summer." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this since July," he said. She turned back to the rack and was quiet for a moment. She thought about what it would mean, not the logistics. She could work those out, but what it would mean at a level beneath logistics. She had spent 3 years at Raven Hollow, making things that disappeared into other people's mouths without anyone knowing her name. She had spent nearly a year at Stone Ridge making things that sustained a whole community of people who now knew exactly who made them and what it cost to make them. The idea of making things that went out further than that traveled, that reached people she'd never see, was something she hadn't let herself think about because it had seemed too large. Too much like wanting something that was too good to be real. She had, over the course of this year, been getting incrementally better at wanting things that were too good to be real. "There's a parcel," Caleb said, carefully, south of the main property. "About 12 acres. There's a good building site on the north end of it, near the road." She looked at him. "I was thinking about it in the context of the expansion, but the expansion is going north. The south parcel doesn't fit the ranch's use in any practical way." He paused. "It would make a good home site for someone who wanted to build." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's 2 things you're proposing," she said. "At the same time, I know," he said. "I could separate them if you want. Say them on different days." She thought about it. "No," she said. "Say them now." He looked at her. "Build something with me, Eliza. The bakery if you want it. A home if you'll have it. I know it's more than the front room conversation." I know it's a large thing to put in front of someone who spent 3 years learning to be careful about large things. She looked at the bread on the rack, at the tin on the shelf above the counter, at the window that faced east toward the cabin where she'd lived for 10 months, where the sourdough starter had lived on the shelf he'd built before she arrived. She was not a person who made decisions emotionally. She made them carefully, with full information, after honest assessment of the actual situation. She had always been that way, and the years at Raven Hollow had made her more so, not less. So she thought about it honestly. She thought about what she knew about this man. She thought about the coat that was good but not new, the coffee left on the counter without being asked, the fence post she'd mentioned at midnight, and the fact that he'd told Garrett about it the next morning, the plate of food set in front of her when she'd been forgetting to eat, the way he'd described her judgment to Reston without softening it for an audience that would use it against her. The 11 years of running a ranch alone in a way that left every person in it with their dignity intact. She thought, a person's character is visible in the smallest things, if you're paying attention. And I have been paying attention for 10 months, she thought. Walter Crowe was visible in the small things, too. He was visible in the way he said things that were unfair in a patient voice, in the way he held open the door for the people who could do something for him and let it swing shut on everyone else. He was visible long before he became the version of himself that took coins out of her hand. She had learned to read the small things. She had read them here. And what she'd read, over 10 months of paying very close attention, was a man who was exactly as good as he looked, not in the way of a man who was performing goodness, but in the way of a man who had simply decided a long time ago how he was going to live, and had been living that way quietly ever since. That was rare. She knew how rare it was. She had seen enough of the alternative to know the difference with her whole body. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said. To both. Something moved across his face, not relief exactly, not triumph. Something quieter than either of those. The expression of a man who had hoped for something for a long time, and has just been told the hoping was warranted. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, I'll talk to Ardell about the south parcel this week. I need to think about the bakery layout, she said. The oven placement matters. Tell me what you need, he said. I'll build it, she looked at him. I know you will, she said. She went back to the bread. He stayed in the kitchen longer than usual that evening. They were married in December one year, almost exactly, from the night Caleb had walked into Raven Hollow and asked who made the biscuits. It was not a large ceremony. Neither of them wanted large. They stood in the front room of Stone Ridge on a Saturday morning, with the ranch hands gathered in whatever clean clothes they had available, and Ardell serving as witness and a woman named Clara, who was the wife of the Milford dry goods owner, and who had become, over the course of the year, something like the first friend Eliza had made in the territory. Clara had insisted on bringing food, because that was how Clara showed affection, and Eliza had let her because she understood that impulse better than most. Holt cried. He denied this afterward with great conviction and zero credibility. Garrett did not cry, but shook Caleb's hand so firmly and for so long that Caleb had to extract it with some effort. Perez, the young hand who'd been at Stone Ridge since before Eliza arrived, brought wildflowers he'd somehow found in December, which was either a miracle of seasonal botany or evidence of a significant personal effort that he was too embarrassed to explain. She accepted them like they were the most natural thing in the world and put them in a jar on the kitchen counter, where they stayed until they were thoroughly done. The day was cold and bright and ordinary in all the ways that the best days are ordinary, nothing dramatic about the light or the weather. Just a December morning on a working ranch in the territory, with smoke from the chimneys and horses in the pasture, and a table full of Clara's food and 60 people's goodwill, which was, as it turned out, more than enough. That evening, after everyone had gone back to where they needed to be, Eliza sat in the kitchen alone for a few minutes before joining Caleb in the main house. She sat at the small table by the window and looked at the kitchen, at the stove she'd reorganized in her first week, the shelves she'd rebuilt in March, the new cutting surface she'd had installed in July, the jar of Perez's December wildflowers on the counter. She thought about a different kitchen, a different woman in it, 4 o'clock in the morning, who had stopped believing she was worth being seen. She thought about how quietly that version of her had accepted the smallness of what she'd been given, how she had adjusted and adjusted and adjusted to accommodate someone else's decision about what she deserved, until the adjustment had become the posture, and she'd forgotten there'd ever been another way to stand. She thought about the thing that nobody tells you about being treated badly for a long time, which is that it doesn't feel like being treated badly after a while. It starts to feel like the truth. It starts to feel like an accurate description of you. And the most dangerous part of it is how reasonable it sounds, because the person doing it is patient and calm, and patience and calm read as credibility, And so after long enough, you start to trust the patient, calm assessment of yourself over your own. She had trusted Walter's assessment of herself for 3 years. She had almost not left. That was the part she came back to, sometimes late at night when she was honest with herself. How close she'd come to staying. How many times she had talked herself out of the door, because leaving felt riskier than staying, and staying, for all its costs, was at least familiar. She knew what it cost to stay. She didn't know what leaving would cost, and the unknown cost felt larger than the known one, even when the known one was significant. The thing that had finally made her leave was not Caleb's offer, not entirely. The offer had been a door, but she'd been standing near the door for a long time without going through it. What had made her go through it was the girl at the table, and the mother's hand on the girl's arm, and the expression on the mother's face, that held still look of a woman deciding not to make things worse, and the recognition, like touching something cold and hard, of herself in that face. She had not wanted to be that. She had not wanted to still be that in another year, or 5 years, or 10. So she had left. And the leaving had cost exactly as much as she'd feared and less than she'd feared, which is how leaving usually works. The fear of it is calibrated to the worst possible version, and the actual experience is the real version, which is hard in specific ways you didn't anticipate and survivable in ways you didn't dare count on. She had survived it, and arrived here, and built something she hadn't imagined building when she'd packed the tin and walked out of Raven Hollow into the December cold. She sat with all of that for a few minutes in her kitchen, on the last evening of being only the head cook at Stone Ridge. Then she got up and turned off the lamp and went through to the main house, where her husband was waiting. The south parcel broke ground the following April, when the frost came out of the ground enough to work with. Caleb had drawn up plans over the winter with input from a builder in Milford who specialized in ranch structures, and Eliza had reviewed them and made changes, and the builder had come back with revised plans, and she had made more changes, and by the time they actually started building, the plans looked significantly different from the original drawings, in ways that reflected the specific needs of 2 specific people who knew exactly how they lived and what they needed the space to do. The house was not large. They had not wanted large. It had a kitchen that was bigger than the one in the main house, which was the first thing she'd specified, not vanity, purely functional, because if she was going to run a bakery operation out of this property, she needed the space to do it properly. It had a south-facing room with good light for the winter months. It had a garden plot that Caleb had leveled and fenced before the foundation was even poured, because she had mentioned wanting a garden in passing one evening, and he had apparently written it down. She planted it in May. Not everything she wanted the first year of a garden is about learning what the soil will hold and what the sun will do and where the water naturally goes, and she knew better than to overcommit before she understood the land. She planted the things she knew, onion and carrot, and the herbs she used most in the kitchen, sage and thyme, and a row of something that might have been lavender if the conditions were right, which they turned out to be. She found herself in the garden most mornings before the kitchen work started. Just 20 minutes, sometimes less. Moving through the rows in the early light, checking what had come in overnight, pulling the weeds that were always there before you wanted them, turning the soil where it needed turning. It was not efficient use of her time in any calculable sense, but it was the part of the morning she looked forward to most, which told her something about what she needed that she hadn't known she needed until she had it. Caleb understood this without her having to explain it, which was the consistent characteristic of him that she kept encountering and kept finding remarkable, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so consistently present. He simply understood what mattered to her by paying attention to what she did, and he arranged the world around that understanding, without requiring her to ask for it in words. This was a form of care she had not had from another person since her mother, and she didn't take it for granted even after she'd gotten used to it. She expanded the kitchen operation gradually. Through the summer of 1890, she started making extra bread to send on the supply wagons to Milford, through an arrangement she'd made with a woman who ran a small general store there and who had agreed to sell the bread on commission. The first batch sold out in 2 hours. The second batch sold out before the wagon finished unloading. By August, she had a waiting list, which was a thing she had not previously had occasion to think about. She handled the waiting list the same way she handled everything practically, with a written system. She did not tell people what they wanted to hear. She told them when their order would be ready, and she made sure it was ready by then. And if it wasn't going to be ready by then, she said so in advance, rather than letting them arrive and find nothing waiting. Word spread the way. Good things spread in small territories, person to person, with the particular credibility that comes from someone saying, "I tried it myself," rather than "I heard." A rancher's wife in Milford told the woman who ran the school board, The school board woman told her sister in the next town east. By October, Eliza had requests coming from 40 miles away, which was further than the supply wagons went without special arrangement. She did not overextend. She knew what the current operation could produce, and she did not promise more than that, because she had seen what happened to things that grew faster than the ground could hold them. Reston's concern had been a version of that, a growth built on pressure and paper rather than on what was actually there. She was not going to make her bakery into a version of that. She was going to grow it the way you grew a garden correctly, in the right season, at the pace the soil allowed. By the following spring, she had hired her first additional baker, a young woman named Ruth, who had grown up on a homestead east of Stone Ridge, and who had, when she sat down in Eliza's kitchen for the conversation that functioned as an interview, looked at the starter on the shelf and asked what kind it was with the focused curiosity of someone who actually wanted to know. Eliza had known within 10 minutes that she was the right person. She paid Ruth fairly. She put the terms in writing from the first day. She explained what the work required and what she expected, and what Ruth could expect from her, and she was honest about both sides of it, without making either sound easier than it was. She did not describe the outcomes as smooth or certain, because they weren't, and she had learned from Walter Crowe that the person who tells you only the good version is the person who wants something from you. Ruth, for her part, turned out to be not quite what Eliza expected, more opinionated than she'd seemed in the interview, with a perfectionist streak that occasionally created friction when she thought a batch wasn't right, and Eliza thought it was close enough, and they had an order to fill. These were real disagreements, not small ones, and they had real arguments about them in the kitchen, on 3 or 4 occasions. The kind where both of them went away, still believing they were right. They were both right most of the time. This was the thing about building something with another person. It was never as clean as the picture in your head, because another person had their own picture, and their own reasons, and their own standards, and the thing that actually got built existed in the between the two pictures, which was a messier space than the person had planned for, but which usually turned out to be more durable than either picture on its own would have been. Eliza learned this in the bakery with Ruth. She had already been learning it in the marriage with Caleb. The marriage was not a perfect thing. She would not have trusted it if it had been. Caleb was not easy to live with in certain specific ways that she had not fully understood until she was living with him. He was too internal. He worked through problems inside himself for too long before he said anything, so that by the time he mentioned something, it had become larger inside him than it would have been if he'd said it earlier. She had to learn to ask, which went against her preference for waiting until someone said what they meant, and the asking sometimes irritated him because he was in the habit of managing himself alone and having someone check on the management felt, occasionally, like criticism of his process. They had arguments. Not violent ones, neither of them were prone to violence of any kind, including emotional violence, but genuine ones, with real disagreement underneath them, about things that mattered. About the pace of the bakery expansion, which Caleb thought could be faster, and Eliza knew had to be slower. About the handling of a boundary dispute with a neighboring rancher that was minor, but festered for 6 months before they resolved it. About how much of Stone Ridge's fall revenue went into reserve and how much went into development, which was a question with legitimate answers on both sides, and which they had the same argument about twice a year for the first 3 years. These arguments were sometimes loud. They were always honest. They ended with both of them knowing more about what the other person actually thought than they had before the argument started, which was, as far as Eliza could tell, the correct function of an argument between two people who were trying to build something together. She had grown up watching her mother make herself agreeable to prevent conflict, and had watched the conflict come anyway, underneath where agreement couldn't reach it. She had spent 3 years agreeing with Walter Crowe, and the agreement had cost her and solved nothing. She was not going to spend the rest of her life agreeing with anyone when she thought they were wrong, including the man she'd married. Caleb, to his credit, understood this about her from the beginning, and had not welcomed the disagreements exactly, because no one welcomes disagreement, but recognized them as honest and treated them as such. He did not do what Walter had done, which was to receive a challenge, and immediately begin constructing a version of events in which the challenge was a personal failing of the challenger. He just argued his side and listened to hers, and they worked it out, or they didn't work it out today and came back to it tomorrow. That was all. That was the whole of it. She had once thought that what she wanted from a life was safety, which she had defined as the absence of risk. She had learned by degrees that what she actually wanted was something different, a situation in which she could take risks, honestly, and know that the ground under her was solid, so that if she fell, it was because she'd misjudged the step, rather than because someone had moved the ground while she was looking elsewhere. Walter had moved the ground. That was what he did. And what men like him did, they created instability and then offered themselves as the solution to it. And the solution cost you something, and the instability was the tool. Caleb had never moved the ground. In 3 years of marriage, by the time she was thinking about this clearly enough to articulate it, he had never once arranged a situation in a way that benefited him at her expense. He had never used what he knew about her against her. He had never held his wealth or his position as something over her head or adjusted his behavior based on whether it would make him look good to people who were watching. This was not a small thing. She knew it was not a small thing because she had lived the alternative, and the alternative had an exact cost she could describe in detail. The thing about being treated well consistently over time is that you stop bracing for the change. The brace is the physical sensation of expecting the ground to move. It lives in the shoulders, in the jaw, in the way you hold yourself when you're in a space that has proven unreliable. She had braced in Walter Crow's station for 3 years and hadn't known she was doing it until she'd been at Stone Ridge long enough for it to start going away. And the going away was almost painful, like circulation returning to a numb limb. She was fully warm now, had been for a long time. The winter of 1893 was mild enough that the ground didn't freeze hard until February, which meant the garden survived longer into the fall than usual. She was in it on a November afternoon, pulling the last of the root vegetables before the first serious cold came, when she heard Caleb's horse coming up the road from the direction of Milford. He'd been in town for 2 days on business, something to do with the northern herd's grazing permits, which required an annual conversation with the territorial office that Caleb handled himself rather than through Ardell, because he preferred to look the relevant people in the eye when the conversation was about something that mattered. She heard him come in through the main gate, and then she heard him stop, which was not where he usually stopped, and she stood up from the garden row and looked toward the road. He was sitting on the horse just inside the gate, looking at the house. She had looked at it 1,000 times, and she could still see what he was seeing: the south-facing room with its winter light, the kitchen addition on the east side that had been built in the 2nd year, the garden that was mostly bare now but had been abundant 3 weeks ago and would be again in April, the smoke from the kitchen chimney, which meant Ruth was working a late batch, the lamp already lit in the front window because the light went early in November. She watched him look at it. He had been running Stone Ridge for 15 years. He had been building things all that time: the ranch, the herds, the legal infrastructure, the relationships with suppliers and neighbors, and the territorial office. He had been building it alone for most of those years, and what he'd built was solid and significant, and had made a real difference to the 60-odd people whose livelihoods ran through it. But she knew, because he had told her once in the late-night kitchen, with the lamp between them and the honest voice he used for things he'd been carrying for a while, that what the building had cost him was not the work itself but the doing of it without anyone to come home to. Not in a sentimental way. In the specific, practical way of a person who makes decisions all day that have real consequences and has nowhere to put the weight of that at the end of the day except back inside himself. She had been somewhere to put it, and he had been the same for her, in the different way that it manifested for her not the weight of decisions, but the weight of finally being believed, of finally being in a situation where her judgment was received as judgment rather than presumption, and the effort required to trust that it was real and would stay real. They had been the answer to each other's specific question. Not the general question, not the broad human question of loneliness or connection, but the particular question that each of them had been carrying. She thought, "It is a remarkable thing to have your particular question answered. Most people go looking for the general answer, the one that's supposed to work for everyone. The particular answer is rarer and less advertised and usually arrives sideways, from a direction you weren't watching. Hers had arrived from the direction of a man who stopped at the end of a table in a forgotten way station and asked who made the biscuits. She watched him see the house. She watched him see what they had built. Then he saw her in the garden, and whatever private thing had been on his face in that moment shifted into the expression she knew best, the direct, present, slightly understated one that was simply him. "Good trip," she called. "Permits renewed," he said. "No complications." Ruth made a late batch. "There'll be something hot if you want it." He got down from the horse. "How's the garden?" "Done for the year," she said. "Mostly." She looked down at the row she'd been working. "I'm going to try the new seed variety next spring. The supplier in Denver Clara mentioned." "Good," he said. He tied the horse at the post and started toward her. "There's a letter from Webb. Came in at Ardell's office." "How is he?" "Well, from what I can tell. He's got a granddaughter now." He reached her at the edge of the garden and looked at the last of the root vegetables in the bucket. "You got them all?" "The ones worth getting," she said. She picked up the bucket. He took it from her. Not because she couldn't carry it, she was perfectly capable of carrying it, but in the easy, habitual way of a man who picks up the thing because his hands are free, and hers are occupied with taking off the garden gloves. She let him because after 4 years she knew the difference between a gesture that was about her capability and a gesture that was just a person helping. Because they could, they walked toward the house. It was not a dramatic moment. The afternoon light was going in the ordinary way it went in November, slant and gray, and the ground was hard under their feet, and the horse needed to be put up, and Ruth's late batch was going to be done in about 20 minutes, based on the smell coming from the kitchen chimney. They walked toward the house the same way they had walked toward it 1,000 times practically, with things to do, at the pace of two people whose days had real demands in them, and who were not finished with the day's demands yet. But she was aware, with the particular awareness that she had developed over 4 years of paying attention to her own life, the way she'd always paid attention to everything else, of the specific texture of this. The bucket, the gloves, the horse at the post, the lamp in the window. The ordinary accumulation of a life being lived without apology in the place it had chosen to be. She had almost not had this. She had almost stayed. That was the thing she came back to when she needed to remember what mattered, not the dramatic moments, not the storm or the legal fight or the night in the front room when she said yes to both things at once, but the nearness of not having it. The fact that she had been 20 minutes away from going to bed in Raven Hollow instead of walking out of it. The fact that she had almost let Walter Crow's patient, calm voice become her own voice inside her head. She had not. And here was the result. Not perfect, she would not have said perfect, would not have wanted it to be, because perfect things had no room to grow, and she was still growing, still adjusting, still learning what the soil would hold. But real, solid, built by her own hands and by his hands and by the particular decision each of them had made, at different moments and for different reasons, to stop staying in the wrong place long enough to find the right one. Ruth was still in the kitchen when they came in, pulling the last trays from the oven, and she looked up and said something about the flour order that needed settling before Monday, and Caleb set the vegetable bucket on the counter and listened to the logistics in the way of a man who had accepted that this kitchen was not his kitchen, and that the logistics of it were not his logistics to manage, which was its own form of the trust that everything here had been built on. Eliza settled the flour question. She looked at the trays cooling on the rack, the bread dark and even, and smelling of the starter that was older than Stone Ridge, older than her time in the territory, older than anything in this building, and she thought, this is what patience looks like when it becomes something real. Ruth left after the trays were stable. Caleb went to tend the horse. Eliza stood alone in the kitchen for a few minutes in the early evening, same as she had on her wedding day, same as she had the morning she'd arrived and salvaged the stew that Holt had destroyed. The tin was on the shelf. It was always on the shelf. It had been on the shelf above every counter she'd stood at in this territory, and it would be on the shelf above whatever counter came next. Because some things you carried with you, not because they were useful in themselves, but because they were the connective thread between who you had been and who you were now, and the thread mattered. She thought about what she'd want to tell the version of herself in Walter Crow's kitchen, the one washing plates at 10 o'clock at night with empty hands. She thought, I would tell her that the fear is real and the cost is real, and you should feel it honestly, and not pretend it's smaller than it is. I would tell her that the fear of leaving is not the same as a reason to stay. I would tell her that the patient, calm voice that says you aren't worth more than this is not an honest voice. It's a voice that benefits from your believing it. And a voice that benefits from your believing something has a stake in keeping you in place. And a voice with a stake in keeping you in place is not the same as a voice that knows the truth about you. I would tell her the truth about you is visible in what you make and how you make it, and who you are when nobody is watching. And if someone is watching and still doesn't see it, that is information about them, not about you. I would tell her, leave. I would tell her, it costs exactly as much as you think, and then it stops costing, and then you start building. And what you build turns out to be larger than what you feared losing, and the ground is more solid than it looked from inside the place you were afraid to leave. She would not have believed it, that woman at 10 o'clock at night with empty hands. She would have listened and nodded and gone back to the plates, because you cannot hand a person a future they can't yet imagine. You can only arrange your own circumstances honestly and do the next right thing with the materials in front of you, and hope that the accumulation of those choices eventually gets you somewhere worth the trip. It had. It absolutely had. She heard Caleb coming back from the stable, his specific step on the path outside, which she knew as well as she knew any sound associated with this place. She heard the door handle. She turned toward the stove because there was still supper to think about, and the day was not finished yet. He came in. He hung up his coat. He looked at her at the stove, and then at the bread on the rack, and then at the tin on the shelf. Same batch as always, he said. Same starter, she said. New ratio I've been working on. He picked up one of the test pieces she'd set aside. He tasted it. He was quiet for a moment. Well, he said. I know, she said. The crumb's still not quite. It's better than last week's. Marginally. Better than anything I had in 6 weeks on the trail before I walked into Raven Hollow, he said. She shook her head. That is a very low bar. It's the bar I started with, he said. I'm allowed to keep it. She looked at him. The same face she'd looked at, across a table in a way station, and across the front room of a ranch, and across 4 years of mornings and arguments and supper dishes, and the particular late-night silence of 2 people, working through their separate papers in the same room. The same face, and still the one she was most glad to see at the end of a day. Sit down, she said. I'll have supper ready in 30 minutes. He sat. She cooked. The lamp burned on the counter, and the starter lived on the shelf, and the garden slept under the November ground waiting for April, and the bread cooled on the rack, and outside the territory went on being what it was, hard and wide and indifferent to individual effort in the way that large things are indifferent, and inside the kitchen of the house on the south parcel of Stone Ridge, 2 people who had each taken the risk of leaving the wrong place were doing what they did every evening, simply continuing the life they'd built. Not perfectly, not without cost, but with their whole selves and their own hands, and the specific kind of trust that only grows between people who have been honest with each other through the difficult seasons, and come out the other side, still choosing to be in the same room. The starter would outlast them. The garden would come back. The bread would be made by hands that learned from her hands, the way her hands had learned from her mother's, and the knowledge would keep moving forward into kitchens she'd never see, carrying something of her in it, the way all made things carry something of the maker. That was enough. That was she had come to understand. Exactly enough. She had been the woman nobody saw, and she had become, through her own stubborn, careful, hard-won choosing, exactly who she had always been, just finally in a place that was worth being.